Hello. A couple of days ago, I was able to have the pleasure of a discussion with both Jennifer Roach and Robert Boylan, who are converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and very well informed and trained theologians. Both of them shared their perspectives on joining the church and the manner and the way in which they were taught by both the missionaries and the members, and how that education and training was both good, meaning that the training was sufficient to answer and resolve questions, but also where there were deficiencies that they felt could have been improved. And then they provided some very practical and helpful advice about how to do that. I think the discussion overall is very productive, and I really appreciated the opportunity to just be part of it and to listen to their comments, especially from the perspective of two people who are very well educated in material that many of us overlook or don't have the time to really deep dive into. It's a great opportunity anytime we can extrapolate the knowledge from other people and learn from their perspectives and their training and understanding, especially as members of the church, to view the perspectives of converts. Hopefully this is a good discussion and you enjoy it, and it's very productive and helpful. You mentioned on your post, and I really liked it from a week or so ago, and because I've known about you, I've watched several of the interviews you've done on Saints Unscripted and with Robert, of course, and I was really interested in the comment that you made that the missionaries, when they taught you the restoration, the apostasy, the questions that you had, and kind of just going through what was your impression, what was missing, and that kind of a stuff. If you could just kind of, and then Robert can do the same with his own experience.
Okay. So part of the background of understanding this is I was in my late 40s when I started taking lessons and had a significant theological education by then. Having conversations with 19-year-old boys who only have what they learned in the MTC, maybe what they learned in their seminary classes, which often are not great or deep. And so there wasn't even common language to talk about stuff. And so on my end, on the investigator end, I had to do a lot of figuring out what it meant that they were even saying, because they had no understanding that we were using the same words differently. So I had to do that work on my end, and I'm perfectly capable of doing that. However, I want to be careful how I say this and not say it in some insulting kind of way. There's a wide range of theological education that the average Christian person has. The vast majority are probably in the bottom 20%. They've read a couple books, right, that might teach them a tiny bit of theology, and they've sat in church for a long time. But in the Protestant world, at least, there are far more people who take a deep interest in theology who are not professional ministers. So the last church I was in before I left and joined the LDS church, it's a congregation of like about 300 people. Maybe we'd swell up to 400 people at certain times. And there were at least a dozen people in that congregation who had a master in divinity, right? They work at Microsoft, they work for Amazon, they get a degree like that because they're interested in it, not because it's their profession. And there is no equivalent in the LDS world. There is no like easy access to higher theological education. So not to say all LDS people are uneducated theologically, that's clearly not true. However, you are much more likely to run into a Protestant who knows some stuff if you're a missionary than that you don't. I had a lot of so I took lessons for 9 months every single week. I don't think we missed a week for 9 months. So I had a lot of lessons and a lot of missionaries. I was taught at the same time by 2 elders and 2 sisters, and we did our lessons together, right? So I met many, 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 many missionaries. The fact that we were having trouble communicating with each other, they would most often make a move towards spiritual understanding, which is an easy move to make and a good move, right? Like they would encourage me, if I didn't understand something, they would encourage me towards prayer, towards meditating on it, towards thinking about it, right? And that's good. But I think for your average investigator who has at least some theological education, it's not super helpful in terms of understanding what's being said.
Well, just can I interrupt and just say one thing?
Yeah.
So one of the things when I was taking classes in psychology in my undergraduate, I had a professor that said, it was really a profound thing that stuck with me. He says, once you define something, you can't even define it until you've identified a term. And once the word has been identified, now you can develop criteria and kind of a whole philosophy and thought process underneath that term. And I think that that's our terms are lacking.
Yeah. So Stephen Webb was a Catholic, a Catholic priest, an intellectual, has written a bunch on kind of Mormon Catholic relations. One of the things that he says is, for a Protestant, it's like entering into a house of mirrors where everything is the same except for that it's not. Everything is sort of skewed, and you look taller than you are and you look shorter than you are. And that was very much my experience, because same words, different meanings. So if you have an investigator who is more educated in theological things, being able to define terms and talk about how you're identifying those terms differently, like, don't get stuck on that. That's not the point of a lesson, right? But when someone is stuck in understanding, going back to the identifying terms certainly helps. My best example of this, Travis, is the one that you brought up of teaching the Restoration. Every single missionary is trained thoroughly in, like, here's how we teach what the Restoration is. My experience was they're trained in a mostly, it seems to me, narrative kind of approach, where they tell the story. Here is how it happened. And that is probably a helpful way for many, many, many people. If you're dealing with an investigator who has deeper questions than that, they're not asking the how did this happen question. They're probably not even asking, like, do you have historic proof that this, you might find somebody who's doing that. They're probably asking the why was this necessary question. And very often when I would ask that question, the missionaries would come back with 2 or 3 kind of standard responses of, like, well, look how bad it got with Martin Luther, before Martin Luther's time, and look at these, couple examples of apostasy. And it is not enough information to actually answer the question. So helping an investigator really, like, drill down and identify what is it that they want to know will help the missionary figure out how to answer that question. Because if they don't understand what that person's actually even asking, how are they going to, they're just going to retell the story of the Restoration, and that isn't helpful for a person past a certain point.
Well, and the thing that's really interesting about that is even the narrative approach that you're describing isn't in the Preach My Gospel. We started off doing every once in a while, I'll do like a Sunday discussion where I put a link on the Facebook page, and a bunch of missionaries will log in. And we just decided to read through the Preach My Gospel manual and just kind of look through it. And the whole first chunk of the first lesson is interview the person you're teaching, ask them about their understanding of the nature of God. Don't dictate or tell, but ask. Develop some kind of a foundation. Because I mean, everybody's going to believe things a little differently, obviously. But figure out what this individual person understands about, like, if they believe in the Trinity, what's their understanding? And as you and Robert discussed in your video, it's probably modalism. but understand what
Mm.
they're talking about. And I think that the reason that's there, at least from what I gather from reading the manual myself, is it looks like that's trying to set the foundation for, and here's why the apostasy happened, and here's why a restoration was necessary. That lack of clarity you're kind of describing, that ambiguity that you feel, that uncertainty about what you're expressing to us, here's how that was overcome through a restoration. But they're just like you're saying, they're just starting with a narrative type.
Yeah, two positive examples of how that was done well for me. Unfortunately, neither one of them are missionaries, they were members. One of them was a woman in the ward that I was attending said, I really, really want to understand like where you're coming from. At the time when I was still taking lessons, I was also still employed at my church. And so I was there in the morning. Our ward was in the 1 o'clock slot in the afternoon, so it worked out for me. And so she said, like, I want to come to church with you next Sunday morning, and I want to come visit your church with you, and then maybe we could talk about like what even happened, like why do you guys do all the things that you do? And that was such a helpful thing for her to be able to, I don't know, so she tried to look at it through my eyes, and I don't think she totally, I was Anglican, I don't think she totally understands what most of that was about, but it did give her a couple of points of like, why do you say it this way? Oh, interesting, we say it this way, and here's why. And it was a really like just natural kind of conversation point. I don't think you have to go to church with somebody else to be able to do that. Having the kind of conversation you're talking about could allow for that. The second example is, I don't, this was a member too. I don't know that most members are up for this, but literally I read through the entire Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Mormon, probably 10-ish chapters a day. And at the end of my reading, I just wrote out questions. I emailed them to a friend who is a member. Some of them he was able to answer, and some of them he wasn't. I kept the ones he wasn't in a notebook and brought them to the gospel principles class on Sunday and kind of put them to the group. And then lots of them were able to offer insight into things, maybe because they were older or they'd just been around the church longer, I don't know. But getting an investigator to clearly articulate, like, here's my list of questions that I need to get addressed before I can make a movement. It was just incredibly clarifying, because at some point the list of questions is done, right?
Well, and then so I love that, because one of the things that, I mean, again, it's like changing the dynamic of our church. And it's really hard to kind of do that, but I think that there needs to be some change in the way that we think. So for example, we hear the brethren in general conference say things like, you know, the church isn't there for you. You need to participate in the church. You gain something by giving something. So go to church with the intent of helping and assisting and building and uplifting other people. And if you'll do that, church will become fulfilling and rewarding. And that's what I found with myself after my mission. You know, I came home and I'm like, oh, you know, I 2 years of never missing a day, and I'm going to take a break, kind of an idea, which was overcome through this idea that you need to contribute, which is a bishop kind of sat me down and taught me that. So, but what's happening is that I think too many times somebody prepares a lesson and I'm going to finish my lesson. And then when somebody changes the subject slightly or raises an important issue, rather than saying, okay, we're going to take sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so's issue, or even an investigator, you know, somebody who's investigating the church, and let's focus on that thing. And then the whole class can abandon the lesson and let's just talk about that and work it through for this person. It's just a much better way of doing it.
It's a real challenge, I think, for people to do, for understandable reasons, because they don't feel like experts either, right? And so an investigator, I mean, like me, like I come with my notebook full of questions. After about the second week in gospel principles, the teacher kind of wisely said, like, look, you're the only person here. I was the only investigator in the class most of the time. They're like, Let's
take
deal
you
with
to
your
gospel doctrine.
let's deal with your actual questions. And so that's what we did. But even in that, when I was the investigator, I could sense the discomfort around the room of people who were afraid because they're like, I'm not the prophet, or I can't give you a definitive answer. And I didn't, if I wanted a definitive answer, I could look it up on the website. Right. Like I could go listen to some Russell M. Nelson talk. What I really wanted was, how is a normal person who's like me working this out in their lives? And I wish that regular members were less afraid of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so what would you give as advice to regular members? So one of the things that I really harp on with the missionaries, and I understand, like Robert lives in a very small, is it a group or is it even a branch?
It's a very small branch. Like how it's like 15 to 20 people on a regular Sunday, and it covers 140,000 people of the county. So
wow.
So so the idea that a missionary is going to be able to take a member to every lesson. I mean, I would be taking Robert every time I went if it's this area. Robert, you're gonna go with us again. But they're I think that the members are thinking the missionaries are the experts at teaching. And it's like we forget they're 18 when they as soon as they board a plane, or they like, here's my 18-year-old theology.
Right. I was
professor.
Lucky enough to I had members attending every single one of my lessons. I also had my friend who I was emailing every single day Book of Mormon questions to, joined on through Zoom. And that was brilliant, because that was somebody I had a previous and ongoing situation with, where I felt like this isn't a person who's just trying to get me to sign up for their pyramid scheme. Right? Like, this is somebody I already know. And so, like, anytime an investigator knows someone who is a member, even if that member lives like 3 hours away, if technology allows it, if their mission president allows it, like, loop that person in, because that's a really good kind of touch point. It becomes much less transactional that way.
And I think that about 50% of the discussions I've been doing over the last year with the missionaries via Zoom, about 50% of them have actually been decent, polite, cordial discussions. I mean, occasionally there's what they call the dumpster fires of, here I am and here's my pastor who also doesn't know anything. But but no, in the process of kind of involving a member, they can form a stable connection also. And it's just, I think that members they're afraid. And I keep telling them, like, look, you don't have to be an expert at theology. You just have to be the stable person who can ask a relevant question. Like, say, Jennifer, you keep talking about the Trinity. What exactly is it that you're talking about? Like, how is that different from what we're teaching you? Explain it to us. Rather than let me tell you, and are you aware that they don't need to know that stuff.
My heart goes out to the missionaries, because they're in that position for a reason. The members have done it to them a little bit, have made them the experts. I would not be in this church if it weren't for a regular member making a kind of bold statement to me that I could have very easily been offended at. And that's what sparked my interest. I'm not suggesting that members or missionaries like become obnoxious, but I do wish that members and missionaries sometimes weren't so afraid of being a little bit bold.
What's an example of that?
Well, for me, how it happened was, my friend and I were talking about Moses. I gave my opinion, and he said, I have a different opinion than you, but it's because I have scriptures that you don't have. And I was like, what are you talking about? No, you don't have scriptures I don't have. Like, that's a fantastic hook, right? It also was risky, because I could have been like, screw you, I don't have to listen to you. That's blasphemy.
You know what? And I'm not saying we want to exclude people from the church, but if somebody's going to be easily offended.
Because we really actually do have scriptures about Moses.
They're going to be offended. their third Sunday or their 20th Sunday. I mean, somebody is going to say something obnoxious to them. And it's better to, let's just, I mean, be a little bit bold, I guess.
Yeah. In my experience, I mean, this is generalizations. The elders are a little bit better at this aspect than the sisters are. I was taught by both for 9 months, so I saw a lot of it. The sisters do better on patiently drawing things out without putting pressure on the person that says, if you don't advance as fast as we want you to, we're dropping you. So I actually really loved my experience because I had both, but most people don't get that. Most people get one or the other. The elders could learn from the sisters to be a little bit more kind and patient and understanding, and the sisters could learn from the elders to be a little bit more bold.
And I think that, and I think that that's perfect, because oftentimes I have missionaries that say they're not progressing, drop them. And it's like, well, what have you done? What have you really done? As far as what work have you put into the conversion process? Well, it's the Spirit that converts. The Spirit can't convert when somebody doesn't understand our view of salvation. And you're talking about,
and it's often the cop-out. It's like, the Spirit does convert, but you know, he uses means. You know, God uses means in everything, and you have to try to lump that in. It's like, yes, he converts, but like he converts through teaching, he converts through X, Y, and Z. Like he even converted very indirectly through like the journalist mentioning like the Book of Moses, you know, to Eugene. You know, I love that story, by the way, because like of all books to lead, it's the Book of Moses. You know, I love it, you know.
It's a great example because, like, I mean, just to be honest, at that point, so he was a journalist. He was writing stories about me ongoing. We were still in the middle of all of that. He still needed my help. If I had gotten really offended and been like, forget you, all of a sudden he's in trouble at his job, right? Like the boldness of that is what, honestly, is what I needed. I needed somebody who could kind of shock me into paying attention to it, because all of my life I just been like, oh, those Mormons are weird.
Well, and I think that with the Spirit converting, that is one of the big problems with the misconception of that. The Spirit is involved in the teaching process, but sometimes the Spirit converting is somebody receiving a prompting to say something. To like, I'm just going to say this, popped into my head. I keep telling the missionaries, I said, look, the Spirit is like a person who lives in your brain and has access to a filing cabinet. And they go through and they look for answers and they look for things to say that, you know, whatsoever I have said unto you, that whole idea. And if there's nothing in your drawers, the Spirit's going to shrug his shoulders and say, I got nothing.
Where, that's a great example, because this is where the maybe less educated, lower economic status person who's kind of in need, where that investigator probably has a way easier time than a Protestant who has a bunch of theological education, because their file cabinet is overflowing with information. And sometimes it's hard to start to organize it in a way where the two systems can talk to each other, especially because we have different meanings for the same words. And so it requires more patience. If anything, I would say, elders, like, please tune into the Spirit about issues of patience. And sisters, please stop being so worried that you're going to offend people and that your only move is the sweet smile, because the bold move sometimes is what people need.
Or the emotional story, which, you know, those are great in their context, but that can't be the basis of it. I mean, it was Kimball, or was it Benson, that said that unless our testimonies go down to the taproots and the understanding of the Book of Mormon, then we just don't have a sufficient foundation. Of course, I just butchered that quote, but it's one I keep on my phone. But if we don't understand what the Book of Mormon is, why it's important. I mean, even as a basic understanding, what it's kind of nails on the chalkboard to be, the Book of Mormon is just like the Bible. No, the Book of Mormon The Book of Mormon is a very different
Mhm.
kind of text. And the first cue of that is Bible means library.
Yeah.
Book of Mormon, like,
Right.
it's a book.
One of the, in my opinion, so I'm a mental health therapist. One of the things I think kind of drives the disconnect here is men in their young 20s are interested in proving competency. That is their developmental task. They want to prove to the world and themselves that they are a grown man, right? So they often take their need to prove that, which is an appropriate developmental task, but bring that into conversation with investigators, and it turns into, I need to prove to you I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a missing of, like, what's your need as a human being, as a 20-year-old young man, versus like, what does this investigator actually need? The developmental need of women in their young 20s is, how am I in relationship to people? And they are desperate to prove that they are worthy of relationship and worthy of being like chosen and wanted. And they bring that into their discussions with investigators. And so it becomes sort of this over emotive, I want to connect with you, and that's going to help you make spiritual progress. And it might make it easier for some people, but it also is bringing their own needs into the conversation and confusing those with what the investigator actually needs.
Right. And an emotional reciprocal relationship that causes somebody to, so you did something for me, I do something to you. And so now you've been so nice, so I'm going to join your church.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not sufficient to.
Correct. It might be for some people, but I also have questions about, like, how long do those people stick around? The missionaries are going to be gone very soon.
And so that connection, well, and it'll last longer if that connection again is made with a member that's local, then, and that member is cognizant of the idea that connection has to be developed. So I've got several friends that have joined the church in the last few years, and they have, I've noticed that if they're going to stay active, some of them have stayed active, some of them have not, but if they've stayed active, it's the universal thing is one of my really, really good friends that I love dearly. In fact, we're gym buddies, and he stayed active because he reads the Book of Mormon. And if he doesn't read it, he listens to it, and he participates in church callings, and he's kind of invested himself in the church. And then being my friend, he always asking me questions like, I read this, what does that mean? And so he's actually investing himself intellectually and spiritually both in the church. And I think that, like you said, I think sisters focus on one, elders focus more on the other. And
I wish they were learning from each other a little bit more. I think the way missions are set up makes that hard, and that's okay.
Well, and I'll tell you, so one of the things from having served a mission, there's an antipathy between the two, where the elders think the sisters don't do it right, and the sisters don't think the elders do it right. And I think that they don't realize that they're two halves of a coin because they're not married.
If they were in different kinds of relationships from each other, they would see each other's strengths and learn from each other. And they're 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years away from being able to do that. It is what it is.
Well, and recognize when maybe it's time to have a sister pair teach your investigator in some kind of a, hey, will you guys drop by this person and give it a shot where you've hit a wall or something. So specifically, and Robert, please, I want to hear your 2 cents certainly as well on the idea that when they're teaching, so more practically speaking, so they come in and they're teaching, the apostasy and the restoration, first discussion. I don't know, when you taught, they were doing Preach My Gospel, right? The 5 discussions.
Me, yes. Robert, I don't know.
You had the 6 discussions, correct?
I only got 2 lessons because I was never actually taught by missionaries. They only taught me once I made the decision to be baptized. My story is much different. So you weren't
a product of that. So, and that's the thing that's interesting and unique about the two of
Some
you.
would say for the best, yeah.
Yeah. So I know as somebody who was born into the church, I kind of geared towards being more of an atheist growing up. I've always internally struggled with the idea that there is an unseen realm, and I'm just a more I've struggled against my own desire for objectivity, and I've decided to accept religion and put Alma's challenge of faith to the test, and I've developed my own faith tradition in that way, and I've adopted Latter-day Saint theology. But it was difficult. It was really difficult to kind of set aside proof and objectivity for accepting a different epistemological perspective. But in doing that, I had to convert myself. And so my parents weren't, I'm like, my mom isn't real doctrinally literate. She's not real theologically trained. My dad was pretty good with the scriptures. He was pretty smart, but I lost him when I was young. So kind of finding that, I actually found it by going to other churches, the Catholic Church, local Protestant churches and things with friends, where I talked to ministers and pastors who would give me like, here's actually what our doctrine is. And then I had to study Latter-day Saint theology on my own to really develop an understanding of it. And so I think that your stories are more of a story of putting in a lot of the work yourself. So
keep going.
How has that been advantageous or disadvantageous?
For me, I don't think there is any other way that it could have happened. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s when I think anti-Mormon stuff was higher then than it is now. If you correct for the ability to access the internet, back then it was bad. The church where I grew up, we watched the Godmaker movie in church every single year. Right.
I went with a friend to the Baptist church to watch the Godmakers.
I grew up in Baptist church. We watched it every single year. And
he was trying to save my poor soul.
Oh, it didn't work.
Well, you win some, you lose some.
You lose some, right? There are plenty of people in the world who are going to believe whatever they are told. And that's how they are. And that's not going to change for them. But if you have an investigator who is more theologically curious, they have to do their own research, right? If missionaries can sort of point them to, like, here are the official church answers. If you're reading other things, please compare them to here, like what's on our website. So at least you're getting the answer that like would be the official answer. One of the things I did when I read through the Book of Mormon the first time was I decided to myself to say, I just want my own clean read of this. I'm not going to go on anybody's website. I'm not going to read blogs. I'm not going to do anything. My second read through, I absolutely will. But my first one gets to be my questions. And the questions I came up with aren't ones that I Googled, right? So trying to get to the heart of what an investigator's question actually is, not the question that they got from somebody else's website, because that's not their question. Mm-hmm. And if you answer a question that isn't their question, it doesn't move them forward at all. So trying to help them really discern, like, do you actually like care about X, or is it really this? Like trying it to help them clarify that, I think, is a better practice.
And I'm going to quote you what you just said and post it on the
nice
page, because that was excellent. The question that they actually have, not the one that they Googled. That's fantastic.
That's better than Bob Millish.
The questions that they Google are important, right? I'm not saying that those probably don't have to get answered for some people.
They can be made important. Sometimes they're
correct.
Yeah, they can become important to the person, because it does create some, because that's the thing, is there's this discontinuity that you've got to resolve. And I think that's why you've got to define your terms. You've got to have criteria. You've got to have some kind of a stance for the term and understand what it means. Like, what is in Latter-day Saint theology, being saved doesn't just mean one thing.
Right.
And so we often think, and that's where I think you said we're talking past each other, certainly, because saved is this in Latter-day Saint theology, but it's actually this in Latter-day Saint theology, and saved is this in other theological philosophies. And so
and if they're coming at you with that question and that's their actual question, great. But if they just read that on a website and was like, now I have a clever way to stump the missionaries, that's not even a worthwhile question to spend time on unless you can help them drill down and figure out, what do you actually want to know?
Well,
I don't know if the missionaries are great at that.
And one of the things I'll often do when I'm doing the discussions with the missionaries on Zoom calls is that they'll ask me a question. And of course, a lot of times, because I've done a lot of digging into what the typical objections to the church are, and I'm just more familiar with them, I think, than your average missionary is they'll say something and I kind of know where it's going or where they're trying to lead me. And sometimes that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to play a game of gotcha. And they'll raise some objection, and I just say, okay, and that matters because exactly why. And what it does, it makes them think, like, why does that matter?
Yeah. One of the things my friend who I was emailing with said to me was, just kind of jokingly, he says, I'd love to see you in a theological debate with two 19-year-old boys. Like, there's no contest there. And for me, it's such a silly little statement, but it flipped me out of the desire to make it be a debate, it out of like, I need to prove to you that you're wrong, and flipped me into, how can I, as the investigator, do the work to understand what it is that you're actually saying? I kind of needed somebody to call that out for me.
Right. And that's the difference in the sincerity between, different types of discussions I've had recently is I've been going out and doing this kind of stuff since I got home off my own mission, but in kind of the different paradigms is there's always the ones that are trying to play gotcha. And I always I'm like, you're 53 years old. You're playing gotcha with a 19-year-old.
Yeah, well, you're going to win.
Why did they bring you? And I'm like, well, they brought me because I'm 40 and I know more than the 19-year-olds, and I've experienced more life. And they're like, well, that's just, why don't the 19-year-olds know? Because the 19-year-olds are taught to go get the 40-year-old to come help them. That's the way the church's missionary program is set up.
Yep.
So I think that those are just kind of ways in which, so what's advice to embolden members
Well, one of the issues I think is like a worldwide problem amongst a lot of members, even like in say more developed countries like America and Ireland and the UK, would be really like the apathy towards like learning more. I'm not sure, that's one of the issues. Now, I'm not saying like you go out, you learn, say, Hebrew, Ugaritic, or you can have a debate about, like, say, the economic versus the hyperstatic filioque clause and stuff like that. That's not, although myself and Jen could actually do that.
I was saying, Robert, that's a great new episode for us.
Yes, but at the same time, like, my suggestion, I'm not sure, like, but maybe you've experienced this as well. Like, if members do their like 15, 20, 30 minutes a day, read the scriptures in context and maybe read up like some good external sources here and there, I think things would be much better, like both on the local level, but also like when it comes to the missionaries. I've come across like some very smart missionaries, but they tend to be the exception to the rule. Now, I'm not saying like the normal missionary is an idiot, but at the same time, I've come across a number who are very ignorant of their faith. They have an ego. And the same when it comes to many members, like they're either very anti-intellectual or they think if you have a question, like you should be dropped. So I don't know, maybe like trying to imbibe like a greater desire to like just do, say, your 20 or 30 minutes a day. I think that would be a very good step for everyone, those listening here and stuff like that. Or, if you find yourself like discussing things with, say, largely say Protestants, Protestants tend to be a bit more academic, at least creedal ones, read what they believe. Like a very good resource I always use, and you're probably familiar with this, Jen, Schaff's Creeds of Christendom.
Yeah.
You know, get this and just reference it. Like, this has the Westminster Confession. This has, like, say, the Articles of the Apostate Anglican Faith. Sorry, the Order 1309, Ron. You know, but joking aside, like, this is a very good source book. Like, imagine, like, the tides are turned. Like, say you're in their shoes. What would you expect them to learn? Do, like, if they were to study the church, you know, like, be familiar with the Doctrine and Commons, be familiar with the Boylan, and be familiar with, like, say, the very basics. You know, so you should do the same. You know, so yes, the goal is to convert them, but, like, you will have to, like, answer the questions. You'll have to also know the different presuppositions. Like Jen alluded to this, like, we often use the same terminology. Now, ours is a biblical terminology, like when it comes to justification and salvation, contra what they will say, but at the same time, there is, like, semantic differences, and that comes down ultimately, say, to authority and presuppositions and stuff like that. So I'm not saying, like, say, an 18, 19-year-old elder from Idaho or a sister from, like, say, Maryland or whatever, you know, should go out and be, like, experts in the theology of John Calvin. But if you're going to, like, say, you know in advance where you're going. So if it's going to be a largely Catholic audience, read a basic book or two in Catholicism. If you're going to, like, say, England, read a basic history about, say, the Church of England or Anglicanism, or read the 39 Articles of Faith. You know, not that difficult to do, even in the archaic language, you know, so be familiar with your audience and also be familiar with what you believe, and make sure it's not superficial either way. And I think, like, if we were to incorporate that on, like, global level, it would be much better, you know.
Yeah, the thing I wish that members and missionaries alike would stop saying is, well, I'm not a scriptorian. Like, don't name yourself as what you are not, because now you have just taken away your own motivation to become better at learning the scriptures. You should be on an ever increasing quest for more scripture knowledge. Stop saying, I have friends who are my age, in their 50s, who still are saying that. That might be fine to say if you're 14, but if you're a full-grown adult, you have had plenty of time to learn how to study, and the church has given you plenty of tools. Stop saying that. Become one.
And just to add to that, like, all throughout the scriptures, not just, like, say, the upper echelons of the church, but, like, the normies, you know, which we belong to, you know, they're commanded, not just expected, but commanded, like, be informed about the faith. Like, you have to give a reason for. It's like you know, the Apologia text in Peter. You know, he's speaking to the normies, you know, not necessarily like, say, the upper echelons or the BYU lot of the time. You know, to give a reasoned answer to those who question you, or, like, in section 71, you know, like, of the Doctrine and Commons, it's like a modern version of that as well. You know, so. Yes, you know, first of all, the whole I'm not a scriptorian, that's usually a cop-out for, like, I don't like the implications of this text, so I'm going to end there. It's like it's a taught ender, or whatever the English term is. But, no, it's like the church has given us, like, very good resources, like the 3 volumes seem to be 4 volumes of Saints. Like, that's a very good. If you wanted to, because, say, church history, that's what I'm working professionally at the moment, you know, more or less. That's such a very broad topic. Or, like, the scriptures, that's very broad as well if you want to, like, learn as much as possible. But the church has provided, like, very good, sound, general, accessible sources to, like, lead to other studies and stuff like that when it comes to scriptures, when it comes to church history from 1830 onwards. You know, and a lot of the controversial stuff is, like, mentioned there, and you can, with the further reading as well. So it's not exactly like, say, the church hiding stuff. It's like my friend Blake Oster once basically joked, if the church ever wanted to hide something, they'd canonize it and tell people to read the scriptures, and that way no one will ever read it.
You know? In fact, I was just going to say, that's the amazing thing, is the number of times that somebody will ask me in church, well, have you ever read that? I'm like, yes, I've read that. And they're like, you've read that? I'm like, hasn't everybody read that? I mean, what? I mean,
I cannot.
It's on the Gospel Library app.
I cannot tell you how many times I have had the conversation with someone where I've said something from church history that is in Saints. Saints is written at what, 7th grade level, something like that.
7th or 8th grade.
7th or 8th, yeah, usually.
Incredibly accessible history. And I have said something in there, and they're like, you know so much about the church. I've been in the church my whole life. I didn't know that. Well, goodness sakes, it's a 200-page book. You could read it in 5 hours.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like, maybe to go back to this, I can understand, like, say, if someone's a very recent convert. Like, I know, relatively speaking, you're very recent, but, like, you have a theology background and stuff like that. Like me, you're a nerd. But, like, say...
Thank you.
The relative, yeah. And I mean, I mean that affectionately. But,
love,
like, yeah, exactly. You know, nerds for the win. But, I can understand, like, say, why a very young person, like a 14-year-old, even if they're a
Mm-hmm.
lifelong member, may not be up to snuff when it comes to certain things. I would not expect them to. They have other
Right.
things to do, like schooling and all that jazz.
But if you're
Or,
a
like, a very
full-blown
recent
adult,
convert, but, like, yeah, like, if you've been a member of the church for, like, say, 10 years, 20 years, 30
Yeah.
years, and you've been active all throughout, it, for instance, like, say, take Joseph Smith being a polygamist, like one of the more controversial topics. Now, if someone's issue is like Joseph was a polygamist and the church never told me this, it's like section 132, bro. Now, if it was like something
Yeah.
very specific, like, say, John C. Bennett and the alleged claim of an affair with Sarah Pratt or Fanny Alger's, like, okay, I get that, but there's certain things that can only be explained away by a willful, and it seems to be a very deliberate, active ignorance.
Well,
Yeah.
And
it's
again,
it's
like,
the
when it-
whole, the church didn't spoon feed that to me. They didn't
Yeah.
tell me that during
This
primary.
is members, yeah, this is members who say, I'm so bored in sacrament meeting. I'm so bored in Sunday school. Okay, fine. Figure out how to engage your mind on the topics that are being talked about. Figure out how to study. Learn how to source an original document. How do you read it? Go to the Joseph Smith papers.
And that's
Read
like,
blah, blah,
especially with
blah.
the advent of the internet, like, there's loads of other things that are like accessible, not just to scholars, but like even, again, your
Anyone.
yeah, it's like the church history library, like they have so many stuff on digitized for
Yeah.
free, and even if there's like something not digitized, you can just like drop in an email, give an explanation, and oftentimes, unless you're like super sensitive, like say an excommunication record or some other thing as well, like some
Mhm.
other legal document or something like that, they're very, very good for that, even if it's just like
Yeah.
for you. And like the Joseph Smith papers, the Wilfred Woodruff papers, I'm
When
sure there's gonna
President
be like,
Nelson, when President Nelson says, don't be a lazy learner, this is what I think he's talking about.
Yeah.
and
And
I
if
think
that's
a lot of
offensive to people,
I think a
it's
lot of the visceral negative reaction to that was like something internalized. So like you work in like mental health, so like whenever
Mhm.
people like are doing something wrong and they get called up on it,
Yeah.
how dare you, I'm not guilty.
Yep.
I'm sure there's a term for that. I think a lot of the negative reaction was basically
Yep.
them kind of at least subconsciously, if not consciously, realizing like they're being called up. But
It is
again,
an
like,
actual problem in our church.
yeah, it
Well,
is,
and
and
it's the
it
difference.
seems to be global because it doesn't seem to be just localized here. It seems to be in America, it seems to be in England. I know in Poland it's a mess as well, because it's my favorite country to visit, so I know all about that, and a bunch of other places as well. And that seemed like it's in the developing country. Like maybe like if like this was like say a very new area in the church where like it's third world country would be a compliment. I can understand like say why there would be issues, but like
Sure.
when it comes to say developed countries like USA, Canada, even Mexico, Ireland, and all that is like, what the heck? And that seems to be like a very anti-intellectual strand of thought that seems to be permeating the church. It's like and it seems to be like the caricature, like say the Mormon epistemologies, warm fuzzies and stuff like that. And unfortunately that seems to be like like cultural Mormonism, but like it doesn't seem to be localized in Utah. It seems to be like a very global strand of thought as well that's acceptable.
It's that paired with the fact that in the Protestant church, it's this way in the Catholic church, but that's not my experience as much. In the Protestant church, there is a huge developed entire industry around biblical studies and all of its daughter disciplines. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are working on those subjects. In our world, it's about that big, and it's extremely poorly developed.
It's one of the reasons that as I was pursuing my own education, I mean, I had kind of indicated that I was going to either pursue law or medicine, but as I studied more in my youth, I was like, I'd love to have a degree in a field like Robert, where I went in and I pursued, and I thought, but you can't make money or do anything in the church with that kind of a degree. And not to say that there's not positions for that, but it didn't even dawn on me. And I wonder how many people think. I mean, you've got like Terrell Gibbons. Terrell Gibbons has an immense theological knowledge, and he's been studying that, and he's pursued advanced degrees. I mean, history, you've got Richard Bushman, who's done a significant amount of work in Mormon studies. Granted, of course, he's also a professor of history, but there's a robust number of works that are produced by a very finite number of people. I mean, Blake Ostler's an attorney,
Yeah.
But
Jonathan.
To be fair, Blake only sleeps 4 hours a day, so that's
yeah,
why.
I know.
Jonathan Stapley is a chemist, right? Like
Right.
his book, The Power of Godliness, I read that when I was investigating.
Excellent.
Beautiful, clicked so many things into place for me. But dude spends his entire day doing science, and felt so compelled about these theological issues to somehow have the discipline to learn all of them and then learn how to write about them. Like, we need more of that.
Yeah, like Brian Hills is in this. I think he's semi-retired now, but he's an anesthesiologist. But it does kind of show like you can do your 9 to 5 and you still have the time, even if you have kids and other things. You can still do your 20 to 30 minutes. And if you were to do your 20 to 30 minutes, maybe like once in a while, doesn't have to be as regulars like us, but once in a while, maybe reading something external, like say, I keep hearing about, say, like Catholicism or Anglicanism is in the news. It's like I don't really know too much about why Anglicans believe, say, insert Anglican belief here, or Catholic belief here. It's like, okay, maybe I'll actually read what they say about it. And it's like, once you gotta do your 20 to 30 minutes regularly each and every day, even if you're like a young teenager, it will actually pay dividends, both for yourself, but also like you can impart it to others as well, like say teaching as a missionary or a gospel doctrine studying, or if you set up like say some of the website, or like even on a day-to-day discussion,
Brian Hales still has children at home.
Yeah.
Right. Jonathan Stapley has young children at home. Like, I get it that doing this level of work, like, that's a serious hobby. And we need more people who are interested and willing and not afraid and can kind of throw their into something that's entirely out of their field and figure it out.
But also the very fact that there's other people who have done it means you don't have to feel like you have to reinvent the wheel every so often.
Correct.
Like say when it comes to say liturgy, like Stapley's book is excellent. So like, is there other areas that one could build up on it? Definitely, but at least when it comes to Stapley, you have a very good secondary resource, and you can actually check the sources. Like a lot of them would be accessible these days, even online. Or like say you find out you're going to a largely Protestant country like the Bible Belt, like Arkansas or someplace like that, and you want to bone up on like say how to respond to say common objections for like say Bible alone. It's like someone here's written a lot about that, so you don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. But like if you think like there's like maybe some ideas or some texts that may not have been dealt with adequately, at least you don't have to like do it ex nihilo. Like there's a lot of the objections, there's already like say some kind of grounding already, or like a lot of the areas there's at least something there, even if it's minuscule at times, or like you might be the one who actually pushes the envelope a bit. Yeah,
missionaries, in my experience, were completely unaware of that entire industry, right? Like not one of them knew who Richard Bushman was.
Yeah, that's
Well, they're 19-year-old kids. I get it.
Yeah, and so I tell them to read something like Wrestling with the Angel by Terrell Givens, or Crucible of Doubt. I have a really good friend who I recently turned on to that book, and he's like, I didn't know something like that existed.
Yeah.
And he's like, wow, that's going to be so great, because he's in the bishopric. He's like, that's going to be so great to kind of address some of the concerns I have with the youth, to be able to use Terrell's views on. It's just like.
So how do you think like a good way, I know this is your turn, but like this is just me trying to out like
no you're
how do you think like a good way for like to make say Bushman's biography or his works, like say I work for an organization that actually does a lot of stuff as well, like how to make that available, or like it seems like for some people, like they're not trying to be willfully ignorant, they just don't know it's out there and they're not necessarily informed, or they don't stumble across it,
Yeah, this is the cultural piece that drives me insane. Is there's a certain kind of member where if it is not 100% published by the church, it's automatically suspicious. So when I was reading Bushman while I was investigating the church, I had said that to several members, and the look I got, it was, right? Like, you shouldn't be reading that.
He was a mission president and is a patriarch. This is not some.
Yeah, but he lives in Massachusetts. Massachusetts.
Well, and he went to Harvard and stuff.
Yeah,
so he's got
Dallas intellectual.
Dang liberal.
The cultural piece where, I mean, it kind of is the spoon feeding bit of, I want to be told from the official source exactly what to think. Instead of, I can take a source and evaluate it for its usefulness. I can evaluate it for all different kinds of things. Members don't seem to know how to do that. I wish that would change, because then what Robert is talking about becomes super easy.
Right. Yeah, because like there's the gospel topics essays, and you know, well, one would take exception maybe with a few things here and there. Like they're a very good resource, and like for everyone. You know, maybe it's a case like I don't know if the church maybe like were to like plug a bit more frequently, like very good sources, even not necessarily secondary sources, but like sources for primary documents, like the Church History Library or a certain organization, Holiday Utah, you know, that someone here works for, you know, or stuff like that, you know, it might be useful because, you know, reading secondary literature is very important. I'm not trying to like say trying to downplay it, but like, and I think you guys would definitely agree with this, like, you know, the whole Reformation slogan, I can't believe I'm using something from the Reformation, ad fontes. You know, if you're familiar with the primary sources, like the scriptures and maybe the journals, or at least know how to access them and, you know, read them, you know, even when they're referenced, like, you know, that will save like a lot of like initial a lot of legwork when it comes to say if you want to delve deep into something or something comes up, you know, or stuff like that, you know. And
I even find that commentaries, like a commentary on the Book of Mormon, you go tell somebody to read one of those, you show them something and they're just like, well, you know, I mean, you've got some members who are like, yeah, this is a great commentary, and they'll pass it around. But really what they'd rather do is go do like the New Testament seminary manual.
Yeah. So that is so interesting, because those manuals are completely de-identified, right? Like there's no footnotes. There's no, this thought came from so and so. I saw something from Ben a couple months ago that a quote, Ben Speckman, a quote from him was going to be in, I can't remember, whatever manual. But of course, like, he's not given credit for it. He's not footnoted in any way. And not that he needs the credit, but to give somebody a link that says like, this person's ideas on this topic are interesting enough to listen to, that we're telling you whose ideas they are. And I wish we did that.
Yeah.
And we don't do any of that.
Yeah, because like, imagine like you're coming across like something, say, the history of interpretation, say 1 Corinthians 15:29, the baptism of the dead text, you know, or like, you know, what does the Greek actually use the pronoun they? But, you know, there's a whole debate about that and stuff like that. It's like, you know, this is my heresy. Whenever I'm teaching, I rarely read the manual. I just see what chapters are to be discussed. Yeah. But be that as may, you know, say they reference something and say like, you know, non-LDS scholars say, you know, Paul is alluding to a Christian practice at Corinth, not a pagan practice. You know, I'm sure like loads of people would like to say, okay, so where can I read the article in JBL or Vetus Testamentum about this? Is like, there's nothing. It's bold assertions, you know, which is a bad thing.
People think that the manual writer is the person who has come up with all of these ideas.
Oh no, they think the apostles wrote it. That's the problem.
Or at least it has the authority of Scripture. Because,
they just think the apostles did it.
It just like, fell out of heaven.
The apostles assigned a committee under some other, you know, the church education
and for those listening to this
system.
presentation, Ben Speckman, he has like a number of posts on this in presentation, so be sure to check out that. And non-canonical status of these manuals. You know, so.
Right. It drives me insane.
Right, and that's why a lot of times when I'll talk to somebody who's antagonistic, they'll pull some manual from 1973 that was published, and they'll say, well, this is that's not the official.
Problem, though, is like even the modern manuals, for the most part, are reliant on, like, say, very late scholarship. Like a lot of the New Testament stuff are dependent upon the Farrar and a couple of others from, like, the turn of the 20th century who McConkie was fond of. But, like, they're okay for, like, maybe, like, historical... intellectual debate, discourse and stuff like that, the intellectual history of something, you know, like, well, you know, 19th, you know, because it's important to understand like what the scholars in the 19th century were saying, like for a Latter-day Saint context, you know, of course, you know, the citrate things, but to rely on them as like, or like Alfred Edersheim or whatever his name is, you know, he wrote a lot about like Jesus and the temple and stuff like that, you know, yeah, that's okay, but like, it's okay to use old scholarship, but like when old scholarship is like has been disproven, especially pre-1947 scholarship in the Old Testament or the New Testament, beef things up. It's okay to reference Bart Ehrman, even if Bart Ehrman's often wrong, or some other source as well.
Well, you just kind of have to. So what I do is I just compare Bart Ehrman with somebody like Daniel Wallace, and if they agree,
that's a good indication.
It's actually that's a
except for the longer ending the mark, they're both wrong about that.
Yeah. So but I mean, because Daniel Wallace has an extreme,
he's pretty conservative,
and then Bart Ehrman, I don't know if he's extreme. He's not trying to disprove anything.
It depends on his audience.
It does.
It's like when it comes to Ehrman, there's a difference between Oxford University Press Bart Ehrman and HarperCollins Bart Ehrman.
Yeah,
and I don't know which one of those put out the worst book. I couldn't hardly even get through it. Of his was the
one on Problem of Evil.
Yeah, gosh, it was
just that was HarperCollins Bart Ehrman.
It was just awful, and it was just sound like
when Ehrman is writing as a New Testament scholar in these fields, he's brilliant. Like he's translating the Apostolic Fathers. He's awesome.
I know it's
Orthodox Corruption of Scripture is like that's the book that made me want to learn Greek. It was that good. I read it once in university. I was thinking maybe
which book did you say again?
Orthodox Corruption of Scripture.
Yeah,
it came out originally in 1993. I read it in one sitting in university. I was thinking of just focusing solely on Hebrew. I didn't think I'd ever want to use Greek. I read that book and it's like, to heck with it. I'm taking these postgraduate courses, even as an undergrad, in Greek. And that kind of maybe, so. And believe me, that's been pretty useful in like discussing soteriology with Protestants, But
I used
it was that informative. So like again, like it kind of depends. But like when it comes to say a scholar writing for even the general audience, but like a scholarly general audience, if you will, that's good. And that's Ehrman. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, Jen.
No, you're fine.
Oh, I was just going to say, I used the Daniel Wallace grammar when I was in this
Same here. And that's like he actually concedes a lot.
Oh, he's tons. Yeah, his
like in
papers
Acts 2:38,
are really great. Yeah,
it's like take Acts 2:38 where it says like be baptized for the remission of sins. There's a lot of nonsense about ice for.
Yeah.
Like, well, it's a resultant. You take a tablet for a migraine. So like the migraine precedes taking it. The whole nonsense. Although confessionally he would have to reject baptism being salvific in any sense. He's a Reformed Baptist. For them, it's a commandment, it's a symbol, but it doesn't effect positive salvation.
That's because he's from
He basically rubbishes the idea like of a causal ice. And he basically calls up his fellow co-religionists, for coming up with it. I have to, so. Yeah, Greek.
Every once in a while,
listening, it's Greek grammar beyond the basics and exegetical syntax of the New Testament.
It's really funny because occasionally, just to be a jerk, I'll quote Daniel Wallace to somebody without citing who he is. Well, that's just some Mormon guy. And I'm like,
or just say Bart Ehrman. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, not Ehrman, it's Wallace.
Yeah, that's actually Daniel Wallace. And I'm like, you should Google who he is and then tell me that he's an apostate. So yeah, just that kind of level. I don't think you have to have that, but I mean, a lot of this stuff's really super accessible. Daniel Wallace does lectures on YouTube. You can listen to him in your car.
Oh, and those other lectures. Yeah, Mounts. He runs a blog.
Yeah. Ooh.
Okay. I'll fix that later. But,
did it break?
Yeah, I'll fix that later. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah. We can hear you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'll just hold it up like this. But no, Mounts, he actually runs a very accessible blog where he does this because Greek, but you don't even have to know Greek to actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, or and he's helpful.
Yeah. Or, and that's like there's loads of sources that like delve deep but make it very accessible.
Well, and even for the time argument, Deseret Book has an app that's just like what's the Audible. It's just like Audible.
Oh, yeah.
You can download
or something.
Yeah, you can download most of the books we're discussing as an Audible format and listen to them in your car to and from work. I mean, I've turned people on to, and they're like, I didn't know that existed. Like, it's an amazing resource. You can listen to, like, in fact, Gibbon's books are actually available on Audible because he's considered a mainstream author.
And all these books except The Christ Who Heals should be read by everyone.
Yeah, I said, I know you don't like that book. It wasn't too bad. Well, it's got some. It's a little bit. Yeah. So,
but no, and that's would be like saying you doing your 20 or 30 minutes a day. Like even if you were to listen to it, because I know, like especially in the States, you have a pretty lengthy commute if you live outside the city center. But be as like that's your 20 or 30 minutes. Or if you listen, say, you listen to scriptures one way in, but like you might listen to a part of a book, like a chapter
And
from say
yeah,
Crucible of Doubt. That's doing something extra as well, and that's in like you will internalize it after a while, you know.
Well, and I think that some of us though need to be a little bit more careful also, because the missionaries want to consume the level that they see from the people who are participating and helping them online. They're like, well, I want to be Robert now. I want to be Jennifer now. I'm like, well,
yeah, and that's like you
that's
have
not
to
going to
inculcate
happen.
them.
Yeah.
And I say this as someone who's pretty bad OCD, and like if I'm not an expert in a topic, like after that, like the whole self-hatred goes through a roof. I'm sure you've dealt with some people with pretty bad OCD like that. But you know, proceeding from that, like one has to realize, like it's like when it comes to certain topics, and this is not ego, you know, I say this in saying this is a bottle. I know a heck of a lot when it comes to certain topics. And Jen knows a heck of a lot when it comes to certain topics, but we weren't born.
There's so many of us accessible online who are more than happy to help missionaries out with stuff.
That's the purpose
that's true.
of this
but also,
Facebook page.
The other thing is like to realize, like, we weren't born with this knowledge. We had to like learn it. So like you have to start at the start, you know, and you have to like build up. It's like the analogy would be like trying to learn like a language, you know. Say, you know, you want to learn, say, ecclesiastical Latin, you know. You don't read, say, Aquinas or the Vulgate on day one. You basically have to learn like super basic stuff to learn ecclesiastical Latin. Eventually you can read, say, the Summa Contra Gentiles or Summa Theologia or whatever, you know, but you have to, you know, it's baby steps. But once you keep doing those like 10, 20, 30 minutes a day, you will, after say like 3 years, after 5 years, you will know a hell of a lot.
And that's how you don't be lazy.
Well,
but also like but also to build up on Jen said, like, yeah, we're pretty accessible, you know, as well.
And that was the point. And I think that some of the missionaries have kind of missed the point. So the point of the discussions I'm doing, I'm not trying to teach you the knowledge. I'm trying to teach you the process. Like it's the process of having the discussion. I try to do it the way that I would perform a deposition. I ask questions, and I ask better questions that facilitate a response. And rather than immediately posing an argument to the response, I ask a follow-up question to clarify that I understood. It's that process that I'm trying to get through. And with having you and Ben and Chris and available to the missionaries and Errol, it's not to become you, it's to utilize the knowledge you've already obtained. I mean, why do you need to become Jennifer on a mission?
You should know, no one
when
should
you
do
can
that.
Message Jennifer. You know,
right?
Yeah, like guys, if you don't have to be an expert in Catholicism, Robert knows a lot.
And if you want, there is a way to do it. You know, it's just like
there is
having taken. You know, it's like, you know, if you want to be an expert in, say, Catholicism, you'll have to read, like, say, the Catechism, which is a hefty book, or Ludwig Ott's Fundamental Catholic Dogma. But like, if you're dedicated or you're driven to do something, like, that's half the battle over and done with. You know, I mean, like, you know, imagine, like, say, a certain topic, say, again, let's just say the Catholicism, like, you want to learn more about, say, why your Catholic family or friends believe X, Y, and Z. If you're driven, you know, reading, like, say, a 300-page book, say, by Ott or something like that, it may be difficult, but, like, at least you're driven, and, you know, and so forth, so you'll do it. But if you're not driven, like, you don't have that desire to learn more or, like, interact with people positively, like, you're just going to, like, it'll be like, to heck with it, you know. You have to be driven as well, you know. And that's in, like, theology, like, when it comes to church as well, it's best done in community. Like, yes, this is like an artificial online community, but still like a community of, like, nerdy friends. Like, we want, like, it's like we all love the church, and we want the church to grow and develop, and for members, like, learn more and be better at gain the church as well, you know, and gain the gospel, you know. So, you know, and that can only really be done by community, like, learning from one another and stuff like that, you know. So,
well,
you know,
one of the
basic, like, say, a Lone Ranger type of affair, you know.
So the missionaries will often post messages to any of us, and they'll say, what books can I read? What books do you suggest? And I always say, you know, have you finished the standard works?
Yeah.
And then they said, well, yes, I've read them. Okay, let me, and I have this funny question, and I repeat it all the time. I said, okay, let me tell you how much you have not read the standard works. When Ammon was taken before King Lamoni, why? And why did King Lamoni offer his daughter to Ammon? It's a
Because
very,
she
very
was
simple.
one ugly daughter.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's like, well, why? And they're like, I often read and I think about why you find a random guy wandering around the wilderness, you'd take him before the king and the king would offer him his daughter. And I said, well, the answer's in the text. What's the answer? Like, oh, I don't know. Because he was exuding the spirit, because he was glowing. And I'm like, no, it's because he was a prince. He was the son of King Mosiah. If the soldiers had killed him, what would have happened to the soldiers? Hey, we killed mighty great King Mosiah's kid who we found.
Yeah, you just start
around.
a war.
Yeah, you just started a war. And of course, what is King Lamoni wanting to do? Probably join kingdoms, right?
Yeah,
so
make an alliance.
Like if you guys are asking yourselves questions in the text and you can't answer them, then reading Bart Ehrman or reading Thomas Aquinas,
or even like the Crucible of Doubt by Givens.
Yeah, you guys are. Go ahead.
Like a few years ago, I actually wrote a post on tips on how to be an effective LDS apologist. Like, and it's not just for, like, say, the Jeff Lindsays or the us of the world. It's like for everyone, as I mentioned, like, we're all called to be in some way or sense like an apologist. Now, not as you go out and start a blog or debate people, but like you're still expected to like give a reasoned defense.
Now I ask you this for the purposes of it: what is an apologist?
An apologist is not someone who apologizes or says sorry for something. And it's also not just a religious term, like, not to bring up politics, but you might have, like, say, apologists for, say, the Biden cabinet, or, like, apologists for, like, say, George Bush, and the Bush doctrine,
It's someone who gives a defense, a reasoned defense.
Position. Yeah.
Right, because the word apologia,
it appears in the New Testament in 1 Peter 3.
And yeah, so the reason I'm asking this sounds stupid, but there are people that have no idea.
Yeah, they often think, like, I get this, like, every so often, not as often as some people do, but, like, I still get the whole what's an apologist? Are you saying sorry for something? Even in the context where it's obvious it's not saying sorry about something, it's defending something, like, you still get it. But yeah, it means to give a defense. I think it comes from Plato. He's one of his works where the character gives a reasoned defense in front of a council. It's been years since I read his works, but that's basically where the term comes from. And it appears in the Greek of 1 Peter, where Peter tells people to, not just like the scholars of the church, but like everyone, to give an apologia or a reasoned defense for the hope that's in them. But just to go back on the importance of scriptures, the very first thing I will ever suggest to everyone would be, you have to have read the standard works. And that's something like you can quote my proof text or quote mine, the Old Testament based on, say, your seminary teaching. Is like, and when I say seminary, I mean like LDS seminary, not like a proper seminary like the one I went to or one Jen went to. But basically, if you have not read the entirety of the scriptures, and that includes, yes, the Old Testament, and you're not a competent reader of it, and I don't mean like, say, Hebrew or Greek, but you don't really know much about, say, this the narratives in the scriptures or the teachings of the scriptures, that's where you start. And it's like, I love books, but like if I was on a desert island, as long as I had my standard works, I would be okay.
Yep.
And so like the very first thing like would be, and if this is the only thing people do, is like be very competent readers of the standard works. And again, yes, that includes the Old Testament.
Well,
and learn how to ask questions of those. Don't just sit in Sunday school and say, oh, this is so boring, I hate Isaiah. Well, figure out why you don't understand it. What are your questions? Now learn how to research those questions, and all of a sudden scripture becomes real interesting.
I'm just like amazed at the numbers of questions that the missionaries have as they pour through because obviously they are reading them on your missions at least, but they're pouring through these and it's like, guys, write the dang question down. If you can't answer it in the text, that's when you come and you ask a Jennifer or a Robert or a Ben or somebody. I mean, just go ask. We can help steer you through to the right way.
And just on the Isaiah, like I don't know. I love Isaiah. I've never had a problem with Isaiah. You're probably the same as well, Jen, and you're probably the same as well, Travis. Like Isaiah's cool, but like,
Yeah.
It's not like a case like, say, even some of myself or Jen or anyone else, like, all the scriptures are as clear to us. Like my favorite book is like Hebrews. I love Hebrews. I've studied Hebrews a lot. But there's certain books that initially one will struggle with, and that's the same for anyone regardless of your educational background. To give like one or two personal examples, I love the New Testament. Like for a while, I struggled with Luke. Not trying to interpret Luke. It's just like Mark's really. It's one of those like. It seems simple, but it's so friggin' complex. John, enough said, and Matthew, it's the best of the synoptics. Come fight me on that. Luke, it's just like it seemed like into like a different feel. I just didn't really feel like a push to study it. So what did I do? Of course I read it, but I also read a lot of stuff about Luke and Acts. Until like I came to love Luke. And now it's not a problem going through it. Or like say the genealogies in the first 8 or 9 chapters of Chronicles. What I used to do, like when I was reading the Old Testament cover to cover, would be maybe just like flick through them, like their genealogies and stuff like that. But after a while, I kind of realized like this is there has to be something to this. I don't really like skipping over chapters. So what did I do? Like, of course I read the texts, but I also read like say 1 or 2 very good books on genealogies in the Old Testament, genealogy specifically in 1 Chronicles 1-9, and that made the text come to life. And like, if you're struggling with say Isaiah, there's a very good commentary by Kerry Moult-Easton. I'm probably butchering his name, but like the eldest Egyptologist. That's a good like introduction and a bit more to that to the Isaiah text. He deals with all 66 chapters. Like if you were to read that as secondary literature, or Brant Garner's commentary on the Isaiah chapters in volume 2, the 6-volume second register, like if you're struggling with a book, like everyone, like myself or Dan Peterson or Jen Roach or whoever. It's not like, say, we're at the level where, like, there's no difficult text. There's text we struggle to read at times, just because, like, it may be odd to us. Everyone goes through that hump. It's just like, recognize that hump and get over it. Again, like, to go back to learning a language thing. Like, say you're struggling, like, say, when it comes to say, a verb or, like, say, the aorist tense in Greek, which is the aorist is an absolute pain for Greek students. Recognize it, but, like, you have to get over the hump, and, like, there's certain ways to go over it. Like, say, read like a good book or a good article on X, Y, and Z, and then you'll come to like eventually appreciate the text.
But see, and that's the thing though, is that are you reading it well enough that you could actually distinguish between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that you can actually see there's differences in the texts? Because I think that too many people, even in the Protestant community, they read those as though they're the same book. And they all say exactly the same.
They might pick out John is different, but that's about as far as it goes.
They tend to read the synoptics.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have exactly the same information in them, and they all say exactly the same thing from the same perspective, and they don't.
No, they're similar. That's synoptic, but at the same time,
they've got.
Say Mark is a. We'll just assume Mark in priority for the sake of this. Like Matthew's like copy and paste with some extra Jewish stuff to Mark, and Luke is like a copy and paste to Mark with some doctor, physician type stuff. That seems to be like the general uber simplistic way of approaching it, but it's not. It's like some of these differences, sometimes they're overblown, but sometimes they're actually pretty substantial, even if they're small things like titles used of Jesus or extra narratives, or extra details, but at the same time, the best way to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is to read Matthew cover to cover, John cover to cover, Mark cover to cover, Luke cover to cover. And but as a secondary resource, sure, read them synoptically, but don't have that as the primary one, if that makes sense. Sometimes people invert that. It's like, no, you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke synoptically, and you can actually have these texts actually reproduce the synoptic material, But no, that's a useful tool for maybe like comparing narratives and seeing why there's differences. But no, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are like, they're similar. No one will doubt that, but at the same time, the idea like, there's no important differences or like they're the same thing. It's like, no.
Well, see, again, the church provides a resource that when I was on my mission, they had this harmony of the Gospels idea. And so, because the church, obviously LDS, the internet and stuff like that was kind of new when I was a missionary 20 some odd years ago. But the idea of this harmony of the Gospels was one of the first things that I kind of noticed was a cool little resource. And I saw Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it would, whenever they had a similar story or a parable or something like that was shared, looking at them, and kind of for the first time, I realized these things aren't the same. There's differences, at least in just the King James edition. So that got me saying, well, what about if I got another translation? So I went to a Christian bookstore and I got another translation, and I started to compare, and I started seeing. But what it did is I realized I was reading at a deeper level, and at that point, then supplement your studies. But if you're not reading at the level where you're able to answer a question in the text, or even identify a difference or a question in the text, then you probably shouldn't be reading a bunch of Isaiah commentaries.
Yeah, start with how to ask a question of the text. That's not a over spiritualized kind of touchy-feely question.
Yeah.
Learn
how can I cause a burning in my own soul today?
How can I wrench this out of context?
Well, they prove text. It's like my favorite. The first thing that a missionary does when they're called is they prove text. That's the very first thing that they do, because everybody gets their own favorite passage and they put it on their missionary plaque. I've got my missionary plaque right there on the wall. Yeah. And mine is Ether 1227. And I just ripped it right out of its context because that's what I thought you're supposed to do.
The youth theme for next year, do you know what it is? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how's that going to get taken out of context?
It's like the primary team, like your sons of God from Psalm 82:6, ignoring but you will die like men, the whole judgment scene. Ben Speckman has actually discussed the primary he once came across where that was the case. But that kind of raises the issue, I think the King James gets a lot of bad press. I think it's actually a good translation from the 17th century, and but at the same time, I don't think this kind of brings up the same modern translations of the Bible. I think there's very good ones. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's some atrociously bad translations, like the New World Translation of the Bible, that's my favorite. The NIV, which
I love the New World Translation.
No, you don't. No, it's
my absolute go-to.
No, you don't.
Yeah. No, I think LDS should actually have copies of the NIV and NWT, not because they're good translations, but if you ever encounter JWs and your evangelicals outside the King James only movement, they will use them, so you might as well actually have that as a ready resource initially, But when it comes to, say, using yourself good modern translations, there's a couple, when it comes to the New Testament, I'm not a fan, say, a lot of these other writings, but Thomas Wayman, he's translation of the New Testament, published by Deseret. Very good translation of the New Testament. He understands the language of dikaiao to be transformative, not legal, so I'm glad. Most people don't know why that's important. Jen does. That's pretty significant. But the new revised the NRSV, the new revised version from 1989, the revised standard version as well from the 1946, I believe. There are good ones the ESV, the NASB are popular word for word translations of the Bible, more or less. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect word for word, but they're closer to the text and there's other translations as well that are pretty good as well. I'm not sure if there's other translations. For the Old Testament, the 1985 Jewish Publication Society Tanakh is absolutely excellent.
There's nothing better.
And there's loads that are actually online on Bible Hub and other places. I use Logos, I use BibleWorks, so I have them already. But there's other online places as well.
Yeah, even if the average missionary or member would start to say something like, I might get a better understanding of what this text is saying if I look at it in 3 different translations, and have those 3 different translations be from 3 kind of different piles of translation philosophy, and people might need help figuring out what that means, but you will get a better sense of what something actually says if you can see it through 3 or 10 translations.
And as far as teaching is concerned for missionaries, it's just a lack of a comprehension or understanding about what certain things are. So like the JST, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, is not what people think it is. It's not.
And for those listening, i.e. a textual restoration of the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, right. They're thinking, well, he's fixing what's there. No, really what he was trying to do is make some King James issues a little clearer according to what was inspired, and a lot of times he's using commentaries to do it. So
what I like to say when it comes to JST would be, sometimes it's Joseph, sometimes acting as Joseph, and sometimes inspired in some way, offering a commentary based on what he knows at the time on the King James.
Well, and it comes back to the nature of authority in the church. The prophet gets to do what the prophet feels is necessary, responsible for the church. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the right decision in 10 years, but it's the right decision at that time. And that's something that people outside of the church. I was going to ask you, Jennifer, how did you, with respect to accepting that there are living prophets, what was that like for you?
My very first thought of that was, that sounds completely horrific. Some old white man in Salt Lake City,
especially one as old and white as President Nelson is.
Yeah, gets to say whatever he wants. I am not down for that.
Now, if it was Canterbury, it would be okay.
Would I? My own background has taught me you should be suspicious of old white men who want to control you. And so to come into a church where there's a living prophet, I flipped out for a really long time over that. And then actually one day the missionaries, I had a meeting with them and they said, oh, the prophet has just announced he's going to come to, I was living in Seattle, he's going to come to Safeco Field. And we can get you a ticket if you want to go. And I'm like, absolutely. I want to go see who's this dude who controls my life now. And I went and he was great. Of course, he is great, but that is not what changed my mind about the idea of having a prophet. What changed my mind was I was there to get a seat about an hour early and heard everyone, it was at the baseball stadium, everyone around me is talking about their love for whatever prophet they consider their prophet, usually the one from when they were young. And they were telling stories about their prophet and just all of these things. And a lot of those people I knew, and I knew them to be intelligent and reasonable people. And the way that they were talking about the concept of prophet, to me, just felt like it made sense. And even before President Nelson himself started speaking, it just clicked into place for me of okay, this is a thing. And I'm not too worried that he's going to call me up and tell me to do something that I don't want to do.
Maybe for say the missionaries who are listening, when it comes to say Anglicanism, and I know Anglicanism is not Protestantism necessarily, but when say the broadly Protestant spectrum, maybe you could give a TLDR version, say the idea prophets, and why modern day prophets is a theologically
yeah. So for most Protestants and Anglicans, the idea of a modern day prophet feels, they might use the word popish, and Robert can say more on the Catholic side, but the idea that there would be one person who has some kind of special access or special relationship to God is super offensive to Protestants, because they have this belief of Jesus died so that we all get equal access to God. And if one dude wants to say I have
all believers,
yeah, so there's ways to deal with that. It's a reasonable objection, and there's reasonable answers to it. But the very concept of prophet for a lot of Protestants, it sounds Catholic, and the last thing in the world they want to be thought of as Catholic.
And so for me, in kind of understanding it, is I get that. It's but Latter-day Saints believe that we all have access. It's a foundational core of our understanding. It's kind of the premise of King Benjamin's address in the Book of Mormon is,
oh yeah, that's true. But you have to understand, say, the Reformation mentality from, say, since at least 1520 or 1521, when 1520, when Luther wrote on the Babylonian captivity of the church, where he said, there's not 7 sacraments, there's only 2. Because for them, priesthood, an ordained priesthood that we have, that the Catholics have, that's an Old Testament or Old Covenant idea, but not in the New Testament. They would say there's no priestly class of people because everyone is a priest. In the same way. And for them, or for Protestants, ordination is simply being a congregational level or even on the global level, just being simply set apart for a duty. Even say in the high tradition like Anglicanism that you are a minister of, their understanding of priesthood would still be different than as sacramental as that was, it would still be much different than, say, the Catholic or Eastern Orthodox view, that
Yeah,
the Saint view.
and it goes all the way down to maybe like a Pentecostal person, where an ordained person is not even seen like almost as themselves. They're seen as like, I don't know, indwelled by God in a way in that role that is somehow tolerable to them, because that person is not necessarily more educated than anybody else in the congregation. They're not necessarily
But there would still
smarter.
be no special priestly classes we would have, even if we don't really have that kind of terminology, or what the Catholics would have. You know, like even when like a very sacerdotal system like conservative Anglicanism, where, you know, there is like, say, ordination, there's like a lot of important liturgy and stuff like that. You know,
Yeah,
and
Anglican. I was an Anglican before I converted, and that probably helped me to accept having a prophet. Whereas the regular, like, evangelical, that's rough on them. I hope missionaries are patient with that, because that's an entirely different way of looking at it.
Let me propose this. So functionally, so like I was saying with the idea of King Benjamin. So functionally, King Benjamin is a prophet king, right? He's giving them the word of God from a pulpit. He's telling them how to interpret whatever their understanding is of the scriptures. He's conveying to them a message about Jesus Christ, tells them to go back to their homes and receive their own revelation. So that's how the church functions today. And then as far as priesthood, we have kind of a division in the priesthood with respect to its power and its authority. All members have access to the power by faith, but there is a priestly class, right? So that kind of has its own complexities, certainly. But in Protestantism, I think that what a Latter-day Saint is not going to understand is who decides when there's a difference. And the appeal is always to, well, the Bible decides. The Bible is how we clarify.
To be fair, like in just for preparation, I actually decided to reread like the Westminster Confession, because like which is like perhaps like the most important. Well, if you read the Westminster Confession of Faith and you actually understand it, you'll be able to have a conversation with like 90% plus of all intelligent Protestants. It's that important. But like when it comes to, say, chapter 1 on the perspicuity and authority of the Bible, and you know, it would be the same when it comes to, say, other confessions like the Anglican articles and stuff like that. It would be cut from the same cloth. The only infallible authoritative interpreter of the Bible is actually the Bible itself. You know, so you know, the idea like Scripture interprets Scripture. That's basically where it comes from. I think the technical term for would be the analogia fide. You know,
nice pull, Robert.
Yeah, analogia fide. And basically, that's just like the fancy way of saying the clearer texts are to interpret the more difficult texts. But of course, begs the question, like, what determines what's clear, you know, or perspicuous and difficult? And usually it's like whatever at the face value I can use to support X, Y, and Z. That they're the clear texts. But when it comes to the difficult texts, or the texts at the face value, you know, I may have to engage in exegesis, and it's like, okay, they're difficult texts. Like, you know, the issue of baptism, like it's so clear baptism is the instrumental cause of regeneration. You have it in Romans 6, you have it in Acts 2, in Acts 22. But they're difficult texts. So like when it comes to, say, Ephesians 2, 8-10, that's a clear text, you know, ignoring the Colossian parallel. You know, that's how it functionally plays out. So it's kind of a shell game. So like, you know, when we had that discussion with the Protestant guy a few months ago, you know, it's one of the things I was bringing up. You know, for instance, like when it comes to, say, baptism and regeneration, this is something that has divided Protestants, you know, since day one. You know, you have the Lutherans, you have most Anglicans, and you have a number of other groups as well that would hold not only that baptism is a commandment and it's a practice you must submit to, but it positively affects salvation in some way. You know,
efficacious.
Yeah, you know, baptism, regeneration, or some type of view of that. You know, you have like loads of when using the term Protestant a bit broadly here to include Anglicans, you actually have that. But you also have like loads, especially in the Reformed Calvinistic tradition. Not all, funnily enough, but many who would hold it's a commandment, it's important, but it's blasphemy to believe in what the Lutherans do about baptism and regeneration. You know, you've had this divide, and like, so who ultimately decides? You know, and how do you actually bring about unification here? Because this is not like a minor issue. You know, like, say, exclusive psalmody? Like, do you only sing the psalms in church services, or can you read like sing other hymns as well? Something, at least for us, that seems kind of a very small point.
Yeah.
No, this is generally a real issue, not just for like them, but like it's a salvation issue. So like, how do you actually one, answer this 500-year plus question amongst Protestants, and two, bridge the ecclesiastical gap, because there's a lack of communion here, and Protestantism doesn't actually have, when push comes to shove, when it comes to the central issues, a real good response. It's basically it's ultimately my tradition, determines X, Y, and Z, and yes, I'm going to claim like the Westminster, the 39 Articles of Faith is subordinate to Scripture, but ultimately the filter is your preconceived presuppositions, and that determines what's clear, what's difficult at the biblical text level.
And then of course for Latter-day Saints, the answer to that is the prophet makes the determination.
Sure.
Yep.
And that's
although I think we have to be very careful when we say that. That's
I know
true.
So how would you say that? How would you
I would just say, like, if and when there's like a issue that the church has to address, like the church will eventually step in and answer it, whether it's a moral issue or a doctrinal issue. But at the same time,
eventually
they still expect us to use our brains. It's not like say, no, the church has not said this, so let's not think about it. No, it expects us still to use our faculties as well. Because I'm not saying there's a problem with how you said that, but like sometimes how some LDS present it, or even how they function when it comes to that, is like, until the church says so, don't even think about it or don't even care about it. But at the same time, we're still expected to use the faculties and the instruments the church has given us and so forth. So
yeah, in the U.S. context for missionaries, more than half of U.S. Christians are in non-denominational churches. So the beliefs of the church are not set by churches.
Non-denominational as well.
They have a website. They usually have a website, and
they have they're in a network of other churches, which is
so
actually
can I be Unitarian here? No.
Well, not to make fun of it, but I guess from my perspective, looking at it, it looks like kind of their franchises.
Yeah, it's like the meme. It's like the meme, and I'll let you finish after this, but this is, I'll forget about it. It's like two ladies screening one, and there's like, hi, I'm Linda the Lutheran, and hi, I'm Mary the non-denominational. It's like, oh, nice to meet you, Mary the liar Baptist.
Yep. How non-denominational, especially the larger the church, the truer this is, how they function is the pastor of that local congregation very, very much functions as a prophet. If he says it's important, it's important. If he says it's a secondary issue, it's a secondary issue. No one in those congregations would ever call him a prophet, would ever overtly say that that's what he's doing.
Functionally, that's the case.
And that's what I'm saying, is that functionally their authority becomes their pastor.
Yes. And you can see why people move churches all the time, because this pastor leaves and they don't like the new guy, and so they need a new guy to put their trust in, that he's gonna tell them exactly what they need to be told. They're basically shopping for a new prophet. They would never say that, but that's what they're doing.
It also shows, and the following term is acceptable in Ireland and the UK. I'm not sure if it's acceptable or seen as a bad word in the US, so sorry in advance. But that's going to show the piss poor ecclesiology, i.e. theology or doctrine of the church. Wait, not all, at least like when it comes to...
That's why it's church.
Yeah. Or like those who would say yes to most of this, they do have a higher ecclesiology, including the Anglicans that you came from. But like when it comes to, say, your typical normie Protestant in America or most other places, like they have a very low view of the church, but not just on the global level, even if they think about it, but even on the local level, it's more like the caricature many have, like sola scriptura, me and my Bible, or me and my pastor is functionally my Pope.
Yep. If the investigator goes to a church that's called something like Crosspoint Church or Venture or New Life, you can almost be certain their pastor is their prophet.
If it sounds like an amusement park, it might be an amusement park or a church.
Well, and
their pastor is their prophet.
Well, and one of the things that I used to do on my mission, because as my mission progressed, I started, I got a little bit more, I guess, aware as my mission progressed, but kind of like some of the experience that you had with the member that attended your church. So I found that as I would teach people, in fact, so I attended a community in Napa, California that was really heavily Seventh-day Adventist. It seemed like everybody was a Seventh-day Adventist in my area. So in the ward, they were either Latter-day Saints or they were Seventh-day Adventists with a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses interspersed. But my wife's aunt is actually one of the kind of the, I can't remember what they're called, but she's one of the equivalent of like an apostle in the Seventh-day Adventist faith.
Okay.
And so I kind of grew up kind of knowing a little bit about it, and I talked to her quite a bit about it. But what was happening is, as I was teaching the Seventh-day Adventists, they would tell me what their church believed. And I found that it was like, I would tell them, okay, well, this is what we believe. And they said, well, yeah, it's the same thing. So in order to overcome that, I actually attended the Seventh-day Adventist church, which was convenient because it was on Saturday. It gave me something to do in the morning. And we went there, and I would go and meet with their pastor after the meetings were over and sit down. And I actually had to say, okay, pastor, tell them what you believe so that I can contrast it. Because all I'm getting out of them is I tell them something and they just agree.
Yep.
And
they
so,
don't know.
And so they didn't know because they weren't being taught. But I think that kind of as one of the points that I think we've talked about, at least we've touched on, is in the church, we are not students being taught. And that is a very different dynamic that exists outside of Latter-day Saint churches, because they go to be taught, and their pastor is usually ecclesiastically trained. He's got a theological degree. They've, got they usually often tell people what they are. They're usually Dr. such and such because they've got a PhD from someplace in biblical studies or theology or church planting, whatever they get a PhD in. So, but they're going there to learn as a student from a teacher, and that dynamic doesn't exist in the church.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to kind of convey that to people outside of the church, that like my bishop is not a professional cleric.
Yeah.
He's
And
just
there's
simply
pros and
not.
cons to that.
Yeah.
And neither are the people who give talks on Sunday. In
Except
fact, they
tomorrow
might,
in my branch.
Except in your branch.
the person giving a talk might be a 14-year-old girl. Right. And so the onus is on you to figure out how to learn.
And that's really something that I think that as a church, we need to be more careful at emphasizing, because I don't think we say it. You know what I mean? I think we all kind of know it, but how many times in a conversation have you had it with either somebody in or outside the church, and you've said it, and they're like, I never really thought about it that way. And then they think you're a friggin' genius because you've identified some grand issue, when really all you did was say something clearly that we actually all intuitively observe or know. And well, it's because we're not being taught at church. The teacher doesn't know more than maybe they have a clearer understanding of some of the passages because they read them. But I've been attending seminary with my son. He's finally old enough to attend seminary. So I've been going to seminary with him, and I am not thrilled. I didn't attend seminary as a youth because, like I said, I didn't really have a lot of faith and stuff. But so I just bagged the early morning seminary. But as I've attended, I don't really know what we're learning.
It's sort of Sunday school.
I'm not
on Monday. It's not,
I thought it was much more regimented than it is. And we have a local member who is, he works for CSS, that's CES, that's his actual job. And he's the coordinator. I don't know what his official position is with CES, but he actually works for the church in the church education system. And he's in charge of the whole institute and seminary, because we have colleges here locally that are that have that. And I'm not really sure what my son's being taught or what was.
And it varies by teacher, right? Like next year he might have a great teacher, and the following year it might be back to crap.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily crap. I just can't
my
follow. Well, I can't really follow a lesson. They're doing a lot of verse hopping. No, in fact, I messaged Robert about some of it, that I think that rather than, because, well, you mentioned it in your talk with Robert, that they're doing a lot of proof texting. Kind of I had a discussion with somebody who said the Methodists are really bad at doing this because they'll proof text. They'll go through and they'll have some manual that says, now read Second Nephi this and read First Corinthians that, and now bouncing around the scriptures to try to prove some point. Rather than, okay, which I love that the church has done that, because I identified this as a problem when I was on my mission 20 years ago. And now we do a completely different Sunday school system where we actually are supposed to be going through chapters and gaining and learning from them differently. How is that different from your own faith tradition? So as an Anglican, what do they do as far as ecclesiastical training in class?
Anglicans have a slight advantage in this, and so would most of the other like liturgical churches, Lutherans, the like higher churches is what they call them, because they're following a lectionary which says this week we're reading these passages. Not all lectionaries are created equal, and everybody kind of follows a different one, but the idea is everybody's on the same page. We're reading all the way through scriptures together. Come follow me is not a great lectionary, but it's a lectionary because it says here's the prescribed readings for this week. Most non-denominational megachurch kind of situations, you get either one of two things. You get a preacher who says, I go through books of the Bible front to back and we will deal with every single verse. But when he says that in a way that also smuggles in his own opinions. So I'm telling you the real truth. We're not skipping anything, right? So he kind of is setting up his own authority. Or you get exactly what you're talking about, which is sort of the topical preacher who wants to preach on marriage and pulls 10 verses from across the Bible decontextualized. So you get some of both.
And preferably we want more systematic readings.
Well,
of the text.
If you want to understand what the actual text is trying to say, then yeah.
Yeah. Well, when they first started doing when the church because they shut down my ability to go physically out with the missionaries, which is kind of what precipitated a lot of this. Is I realized that we could do Zoom, and I could go out with them via Zoom. So, but one of the first things that we kind of focused on was the idea that rather than scripture hopping, which is kind of what our church still kind of does.
Yeah, and that's like it's done on like a local level when it comes to like seminary and gospel doctrine and stuff like that. It's scripture,
which is one of the reasons I didn't really like the seminary stuff very much, because they're like, well, this passage is so great. In fact, I was telling Robert, one of the things that was kind of brought up is they said that in Isaiah, they said this is one of the few times that the word Jehovah is written out in the Old Testament, in the entire Hebrew Bible. And they were acting like that's such an amazing thing, and I just wanted to raise my hand and go, why? Why is that significant? But everybody thought and they just said that as though the thing itself was it's just intuitive that's such a neat thing.
But none of those kids could tell you what that even means or why it would be important.
And the teacher couldn't either. And yet they spent like 5 minutes emphasizing that as a point. And I just
was like, what is this tetragrammaton you speak about?
Like, what are you talking about? And I said, so what's the, well, as Robert's not really a fan of Jehovah, right? He likes
Yahweh all the way.
Yahweh all the way.
Yeah.
Because there's no J.
So even when I discuss things with fellow LDS, it's like, I know if you want to say Jehovah, that's fine, but the proper way would be Yahweh. So get used to it. That's what I'll be saying. And
I mean, we don't have to be that, obviously, that hyper technical. It's a little bit snobbish, I think, but yeah, it's. So I tell the missionaries, I said, look, if you want to teach something, I don't care what it is, find a chapter, a whole stinking chapter, and teach it out of the whole chapter, because it'll also avoid the proof texting that your investigator will start doing. But if you start proof texting, they're going to start proof texting, and now you're in a mess.
I think like the best thing, like when it comes to say like institute or gospel doctrine or seminary, would be for teachers, and like there's some very good teachers, there's some pretty bad teachers. I've had a mix of them. Not to get the impression like you must go through the entire. Say there's 5 chapters this week. Just teach on 1 chapter. Or 2. Don't feel like you have to get through everything, because you have like 40 minutes or 60 minutes, if it's an institute class, because like the onus, it's like if you go into a class like for like a Spanish class or a Latin class, you'll expect, like, say, the students actually have done their reading in advance.
Mhm.
And it should be the same when it comes to, say, seminary or institute or gospel doctrine. You know, especially like the latter two, like you're all bloody adults. You should be able to like read 1 or 2 or 3 chapters in a week, even if you have a busy schedule.
Yeah.
All things being equal, and like if so. And even if they may not have done it, like at least they have the tools, like be able to like read the remaining 2, 3, 4 chapters. But yeah, focus on the idea of like say getting more bang for your buck. So even if you like, there's a lot of really cool, say like you're going through the Gospel of John, like say it's John 14, 15, 16, 17. There's already a lot of stuff in all those chapters, so there's no way you can actually do a good job dealing with all of them. Like maybe just focus on John 17 and the high priestly prayer, like even just a portion of it. And then people will actually learn more.
Yeah, drill down into something instead of an inch deep all the way across.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like the inch deep across is like, say, I've often heard like, and maybe like the LDS understand that say scripture, especially the Bible, would be like it's an inch deep, but it's like all 66 books. Sorry for those who accept the Deuterocanon, like, but the other 7 are cool as well. But like for your typical Protestant, it's like it's the opposite. It's actually inverted. They may know like say Romans 8 or 9 or something like that very, 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 very well, but when it comes to the entire scope, it's like very superficial. So like it's basically the LDS view ass backwards, and they're both bad. It should be like you're not expected to be an expert, like say, or have the same level of competency on every single section or every single chapter, but at the same time, like it should be like both deep and as well as broad.
Yeah. Even if you went deep on 1 chapter a month, I mean, shoot, even 1 a year, that would change how people are able to engage with scripture. Like, it's not. It doesn't even take that much.
It's like when it comes to say the 4-year cycle, that's good, but there's pros and cons to the 4-year cycle.
Yeah,
I kind of wish there was like an 8-year cycle, because
no,
like,
I do too. We can't cover the Old Testament in a year.
Yeah, no, take the Old Testament. There's 1 chapter. There's 1 lesson every 4 years. 1 lesson on the entirety of the Book of Psalms.
And it's not arranged in any way that's helpful. Put the Psalms that David wrote next to the thing that was going on in David's life when he was writing it, because now all of a sudden it's going to make sense. But now you have it decontextualized just as a psalm, and people are like, I don't know, it sounds like a nice poem.
Yeah, like that's not the Psalms. Like, well, Psalms are about hymns, and like we love our hymn book, and that kind of like, that's true. Like it was like the hymn book of the ancients, even of Jesus. But it's how can you actually honestly expect, like, because like the Psalms is important, like it's 150 chapters for crying out loud, and there's so much when it comes, like the Psalms is used in the Book of Mormon, it's used in especially in the New Testament when it comes to say typology. How can you actually you have to understand the Psalms to actually make sense of a lot of the messianic ideas in the New Testament? Like it's again, like I know there's no such thing as a perfect system, and I know like gospel doctrine is like not for like historical grammatical exegesis, more like say likening scripture to your the everyday life. But at the same time, even when I say typology or likening texts, the very first thing you must know is like the historical grammatical meaning, and then you can actually, in a proper meaningful way, like find other uses to it. It's like learning a musical instrument. Like one of the very first things I was taught is like, once you know the musical theory, you'll actually have the tools to be able to break away from the theory and come up with your own stuff, but in a meaningful way. And that's an imperfect analogy, but that might be a good analogy. Like, say, once you understand the historical grammatical context, like Nephi definitely understood the historical grammatical context in Isaiah, but because of that, he could actually use and liken it more properly or more adequately, if you will, to his situation, to the future situation as well. And the same when it comes to New Testament authors. It's like Matthew definitely knew Isaiah 11 was initially in context about Israel, corporate Israel, not the Messiah. But by doing that, he actually had the proper tools to actually show this kind of secondary, fuller sense, or sensus plenior, to use a technical term, interpretation of his Old Testament text as well. It's like we could benefit like from knowing immediately the historical grammatical context of X, Y, and Z, and that would give us the proper tools to liken it better to today or other secondary interpretations as well that are common.
Yeah, and I mean, we're kind of running on time, and I'm not saying that we have to stop, but
to be fair, when we were doing the Anglican interview, I was expecting 40 minutes and went on for almost 2.5 hours. You cannot get the two of us to shut up.
No, I'm fine with it.
So can we discuss the hypostatic versus economic?
Yes.
Okay, after. Okay,
we can in a second.
Good.
So I wanted to kind of get one more piece of opinion from both of you. So in effectuating change, so not that it's your responsibility to do that, but certainly I've found that as I sit through classes and I've had a desire to comment on, especially when somebody's saying something that isn't opinion wrong, but just it's wrong. And how are you addressing what you feel are perspectives or methods that are being expressed by people in the church during classes that you're attending, and when you said I want to say something, and how have you been engaging with that?
Well, I'll let if it's okay, I'll go first. I'll
Yeah,
give
please.
One or two very recent examples, like recent, like last year or two. Sometimes you have to pick your battle. Sometimes people will say something that you will disagree with, but at the same time, like you have to like, is this worth fighting over, or well, not say fighting, but like openly disagreeing about, or something like that. So you have to pick your battle. Sometimes it might be better, like maybe take them in. It's like, maybe say like. Give an analogy, someone comes from like an Eastern Orthodox background and they still think like Mary had only Jesus as a son, and they might mention that as in the context of John 19. It's like, okay, you might like take them aside initially, like, so you have to know how to pick your battles, I once was asked, like, last time we were doing the Old Testament here by the gospel doctrine teachers, like, well, you know Hebrew and you're an Old Testament scholar, so like, can you actually discuss and tell the class why Ezekiel 37 is a prophecy of the Book of Mormon? So I needless to say, I had to explain like why that's not a direct prophecy and stuff like that, and the idea, like, say how the New Testament authors use the Old Testament, or like a while ago someone said like Judas betraying Jesus was a very good thing, and Judas did not do anything wrong by betraying Jesus. It's like, no, that's just wrong. I'm sorry. So you have to know how to pick your battles, but once you do, it's not something like arguing with someone, because that's very easy. That creates a lot more like heat than light. You'll have to also like explain why that's the case, and you have to on the fly like know what they know, why they think this, and like try to explain it to them. Like an errant 14 or 15-year-old, who might think something wrong, how you'll explain it to them or will be different than say a 50-year-old, and things like that. So you have to know how to pick your battles, and like you have to make sure they know you're not just arguing with them. It's more like, no, unless of course they something that's just nigh unto blasphemous, that's different. But like if they're just wrong, but they mean well at the same time, you have to know how to pick your battles, but also have to explain it to them as well. So it's more like I know it when I see it type of thing. But
yeah, my approach is probably similar. I would also rather go with a question of like, if I can see the argument that they're making and I can see, and I know where it breaks down, like I know why that's wrong, I'll try to ask them a question that's going to get them to point it out. But if I don't know that immediately, I don't know that trying to get them there in the middle of gospel doctrines is going to be helpful or effective. But a lot of times I end up in conversations with people after class or in email or stuff like that of like, tell me why you think this, and trying to come from a place of curiosity and trying to figure out like, can I introduce anything that they would be able to make a connection to that might help them at least get curious about what they're missing?
Like maybe ask them like, say, oh, that's interesting. So like, in a friendly, not type of gotcha type of ways, like, what would you do with this text? Because like, I often hear it like say teach X, Y, and Z. So do you think it's an actual contradiction, or like, trying to like create like these kind of moments where like not necessarily like to push the antithesis or like to cause them to doubt necessarily, but like maybe just think a bit more about their reasoning behind it, but in a friendly manner. So
there's a guy in my old ward that I really messed it up with. Like I did not do any of what I just said or any of what you just said, and I just fought with him. And probably every Sunday since then, when he has a comment to make in Sunday school, he prefaces it with, well, I might disagree with the learned Sister Roach, however, blah, blah, blah. And like, he isn't going to listen to a thing I have to say. And he tells the entire room that my opinion is bunk, right?
Yeah.
But I deserve that from him because I did not treat him with curiosity and all these things, blah, blah, blah. And that guy could like backfires on me every single week that I was in that stupid ward. Like I love that ward, but man, I messed it up with that guy.
If it's any consolation in it's like I've done it
For sure.
before, you know. I'm sure Travis,
Yeah.
we've all been guilty of it. So like this is like for those
Learn from our mistakes.
yeah, exactly. Like, those listening to this, like the missionaries especially, like we've all messed up. Like I used to be I'm still pretty argumentative depending on the person, but like sometimes like when the JWs came, it's more like say I'm just here to like bash with them, you know, like when I was younger. So like you have to get over that kind of
yeah.
Attitude, you know. It's because it's so damn easy to actually fall into, but like, you know, we've all been there. So I know it's scant consolation, but like, you know, don't make the same mistakes we made. You know, we speak from experiential knowledge for background.
Well, and if you mess it up, take your lumps, apologize, listen to them. They're gonna say, if I you don't have to listen to Jennifer on this, you earned that, just take it.
Well, one of the things that I've often said, I've had people say, well, we believe as a church, and every time they say that, I always go, why do we believe that? Again, well, you don't know about that? Like, no, I don't, not sure how that works. But we all believe that? Like, I don't believe that. So, and what it does is makes the whole class start teaching me about this thing that we're supposed to all believe in that I don't. And then I get to say, well, I don't understand how that works. Well, how does it work in light of that and this? And well, how does that fit into this little thing? Oh, well,
playing dumb is a great strategy.
Well, and then as they teach me, it's funny because a lot of them will say, yeah, maybe we don't believe that. And then that becomes the new kind of transition. But
and also, like in most cases, you have to assume the person is sincere, even if they're sincerely wrong.
Of course.
I've come across some people who have been very difficult. Like once my old ward in Utah was teaching, and someone actually stopped the class and protested that I would use to describe like section 87 of Doctrine and Covenants. I call it a revelation of Joseph Smith. You know, and apparently that was like wrong. You know, it's a revelation from God. You know, and stuff like that. This person actually stopped my class. You know, I don't believe that person was sincere based on what I know about them. But you know, but there will be like the outlier. Even if someone is dead wrong and they're spouting something wrong, they probably do sincerely believe it. You know, so as difficult as it may be at times, especially if it's just so dead wrong, you know, you want to pop your head, you know, in frustration. You have to assume.
Well, and the only reason I bring this,
they're honest.
The reason I bring this up as a topic to kind of discuss and is that there's a lot of missionaries who are advocating what are not doctrines. So, for example, the infinite regress theory, like, is that a doctrine of the church? No,
but it's an allowable opinion.
But it's an allowable opinion, and I think that that's the problem, is that some of them believe that that's actually a codified, you know, take it to the bank. This has been revealed in the restoration.
By the way, for those listening, this Thursday, myself and Blake Oster will be actually discussing that. And
I was watching the discussion he had with Jacob Hansen and who's the other?
Hayden Carroll.
And so it was funny because Hayden actually kind of agrees with that. And as they were discussing, Hayden was kind of backpedaling a little bit, saying, "Well, I'm not really, you know, I'm open to having my mind changed," and because, you know, Blake. It's really difficult to believe in infinite regress and talking to Blake Ostler.
But that's the thing I like about Hayden. He's actually open-minded. He even asks me these questions about why I'm an open theist. So,
which again is, you know, what's really interesting is I found, and this is my own kind of testimony of the gospel, is that I have, through just kind of a dumb study of the scriptures and a very superficial reading of a lot of the positions of the church, developed an understanding of certain positions. So, for example, I personally reject the infinite regress. I don't think that that's taught. I don't think it's an essential opinion. I don't think it's something that is. I think that people believe in it, but it's certainly not something that's clearly taught in Scripture, really, by anybody in the church. And so, but even with respect to an understanding of God. God's foreknowledge in the context of an open theism, I didn't know what that meant. I'd never heard of infinite regress. I didn't know what open theism was, but those were my opinions. So reading people who had actually expressed those ideas, that were intelligent and educated, trained in theology, was comforting to me to realize that I was on the right track. At least as far as I'm understanding something. I'm not just reading scriptures without any any kind of comprehension of what they are. And so I think that that's another testimony builder, is as you study the scriptures, to read something or to talk to somebody. Reading Robert's books has been really insightful. I'm almost through all of them, and talking to people who have kind of that training and realizing that what you're learning is acceptable positions and opinions about the church and about its history. It is comforting. And I think that there's a lot of testimony that can be gained by including those materials in your study.
Yeah.
So, but with that, we can end.
Yeah. Fun talk.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming. This has been great. I can't tell you how much I love the missionaries, and I think that it's not a let's train the missionaries. This is what some members of the church have obtained to, based on their own diligence, their own study, and their own interest in religion and theology, and their desire to know God. And not that the missionaries need to be Robert or Jennifer, but that they can use Robert and Jennifer as resources.
Love the missionaries.
Oh gosh, I just
happy to
love them
help in
death.
any way. Yeah.
And so I just think that it's an invaluable resource to have something. And I think that some people misunderstand what the purpose of a Facebook group that has a bunch of nerds in it is. And it's not to rewrite their will or to teach them some esoteric stuff that they can't learn from the mainstream church.
No, but so that they have a person to grab to say, help catch me up on this.
Well, I mean, you're talking to somebody who's Anglican, and like, I don't know how to, and not that, tell me what Anglicans believe, right? That's not what they need.
Right.
Like, why are we talking past each other?
Yeah.
Please explain to me.
Leo XIII did nothing wrong in 1896.
To say that the Anglican Church started because of King Henry VIII wanting a divorce is equal to saying that the LDS Church started because Joseph Smith wanted to be a polygamist. That's how offensive it is.
The LDS Church started because Joseph was tired of doing farm work. Don't you know the meme?
Oh, I forgot. Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, he was so lazy that he decided
he wanted an easier life.
Yes, he wanted a much easier life that wouldn't result in his being despised by the majority of people.
But no, that's a good
point. Inevitable murder.
But that's a good point. But that kind of brings up, like, LDS, whether missionaries or like not missionaries, like the normies, should not be afraid to like read like literature. Like I'm not saying anti-LDS literature, but like should not be afraid to like read what other groups, Christian and non-Christian, believe and why they believe.
It will help them.
It'll help, yeah, because like say if we have Jen, the Anglican minister, and like someone wants to bone up on Anglicanism to actually be able to communicate with her. I fail to see like why it would be a problem to read the Articles of Faith or like a good introduction to Anglicanism, because one, it will allow for better communication, and that's what you want. You want better communication, you want better catechesis, blah blah blah. But also, it will force you to, like, in a good way, make you think of what, okay, so that's what the Anglicans believe, and of course Jen is a smart person, she's not an idiot, so she believes X, Y, and Z. What do you believe? Not X, Y, and Z, and that will force you, like, if you haven't already, like, think of why and study why you actually believe what differently. That's always a positive thing.
For kids who are not yet on their mission, but they know where they're going, like that brief period of time where you know where you're going, but you're not yet under the restrictions about what you can read, there is a super helpful little series of books called A Very Short Introduction. And it's a very short introduction to Catholicism, to Anglicanism, to evangelicalism, to whatever. And they're seriously like less than 60 pages. And if you're going to an area that's highly Catholic, please read A Very Short Introduction to Catholicism, and you will be far and ahead above your peers who are just starting out with you.
And it's not anti to read. So, like, for example, if you guys know who James White is, he's a pretty antagonistic person against LDS claims.
He refuses to debate me.
Yeah. Rather than reading his Letters to a Mormon Elder, right, which is a very antagonistic book which largely grotesquely misrepresents
read
a
the
lot
London
of our
Baptist
theology.
Confession of Faith.
Right, read one of his textbooks.
Yeah.
And then he'll actually explain what his theology is.
Yeah, it's like
you'd be much better to have a
Whitey's
dialogue.
actually very good at describing Calvinism.
Yeah,
like, if you read his book, Debating Calvinism, he did with Dave Hunt of the Godmakers book.
He's
Hunt,
not an idiot. He's just dishonest when it comes to representing LDS theology. He's actually a very intelligent person.
And also, he's pretty bad when it comes to Catholicism as well. Yeah,
and Islam and any other
whatever
other faith tradition he tries.
But no,
to
he's very good when
represent.
it comes to describing his faith. Like,
well, he knows what he believes.
Yeah.
And so it's just a I disagree with the position that the missionaries are not supposed to be looking at other materials outside the gospel library, because in the standard works it says that seek ye knowledge out of the best books,
and also
it's just choosing the best books.
I like what's said about the Apocrypha in section 91, because you can transpose that like any other scriptural text or any other source. If you're guided by the Spirit, you can actually be able to discern the positive from the con. It's like there's no ideology, there's no religion that's 0% correct. Every group is a certain level of has a certain level of truth. Like you're no longer a believing communicant Anglican, but I'm sure like you would actually say like Anglicans have the truth on their routines. Like there's a number of aspects or nuances Anglicanism would have with a shared belief when it comes to Latter-day Saints that like as an Anglican you have a better appreciation of than your typical LDS, if that makes sense, you know. And, you know, the same when it comes to, say, my Roman Catholic background here in Ireland, you know, stuff like that. So there's no ideology that's on a scale of 0 to 100, 0. Even Satanism is correct when it comes to, say, there's some type of supernatural, even if they do pervert that, you know, and so forth. So one should not be afraid to, like, read, like, informed defenses of other positions, or even, like, summaries of other positions, you know, because sometimes they're correct, and on the point that you would agree with, but they might actually be able to bring like a lot more to the table because they may have studied it more, they may have more sources, like and things like that, you know. So yeah.
Well, what I wish they weren't so limited.
Well, and what I found on my mission and in my missionary labors, helping missionaries since I've got home, they were teaching about 7 or 8 years ago, they were teaching a guy who was working on his master's in divinity, and you know, he was troubling for the missionaries because I think he was being a little antagonistic. And what was happening is and they said, oh, he's really antagonistic. I said, and so I went and I met with him, and I'm like, he's not antagonistic. You guys are antagonistic. And they said, well, what do you mean? He's raising points. You don't understand what he's saying. And you're immediately attacking something that you're not clarifying that isn't actually what his position is. So recently in the Facebook group, there's this, somebody said, this woman believes that Adam's transgression or sin created a problem in our DNA.
Yes.
And it's like, that's apostate. No, not necessarily, because the fall created mortality. In our theology, we are corrupted creatures housing the spirit that is the actual child of God. So we fight against our flesh by submitting our spirit to the spirit and controlling the flesh. But the flesh has disease, and those are all part of the DNA. So it's not a matter of she's wrong or crazy, which is what some missionaries were saying. It's that she's not saying it in a way that you understand, because you think she's teaching original sin, which is really not what she's saying. Well, we reject original sin.
Or even if an investigator is saying something that's wrong, like you know, sola scriptura, to like unknowingly like say, well, they just believe it's me and my Bible, and they're ignoring like say confessions and creeds and stuff like that. You know, yeah, lots of LDS have this kind of knee-jerk reaction. Like, no, it is true. Like, you know, we're right. If you were to boil it down, we're right and they're wrong. You know, if you were to boil it down to like very bare basics, but at the same time, often you can be right, but for the wrong reasons. And like a lot of missionaries, yes, you belong to the true church, but that doesn't mean you know jack about what the church teaches or what other people believe.
And this is where elders are gonna fight against that, and sisters are gonna sweetly smile and offer an emotional story, and neither response is helpful.
Yeah, because like, put yourself on the shoe of the other person. Like, would you accept that for like if they're a Presbyterian or a Seventh-day Adventist? And like, imagine like say a Christadelphian married couple knocks on your door, and you know they don't believe Jesus pre-existed. They don't believe in a supernatural Satan. Would you accept your like that from their perspective to defend your doctrines? And if your answer is no, it's like there's clearly like some kind of double standard going on here.
Yeah.
And so to get out of a difficult situation, this is what I always tell the missionaries. I was like, look, to get out of a difficult situation, somebody obviously knows more than you do. They raise an objection. And the last thing you want to do is start contending with them. And from a legal perspective, from my perspective, arguing, the person who bears the burden of proof loses. Because to maintain a burden of proof is nearly impossible from a legal perspective. And that's why we're always trying to transfer the burden of proof to the other person. And so affirmative defenses and things in lawsuits are really important in that way to transfer that burden to somebody else. So as you do that, what you do when somebody raises something like they say, well, the Bible alone is the word of God, as soon as you say, well, we have an open canon, you've just created a burden of proof. So rather than doing that,
ask them where in the Bible does it teach that?
What are you
or
talking
where in the Bible
about?
does it say
like
special revelation ceased?
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, just it can be that simple. Huh? Act dumbfounded and shocked, because it really is by our theology. I mean, when I was raised, the idea that the Bible was a closed canon is something I didn't learn until I was an early teenager. Went to a Baptist church with a girlfriend of mine and thought, you believe what now? And it was shocking to me.
There are certain issues that we do definitely bear the burden of, like when we're positively affirming Joseph's prophet.
Certainly, yeah,
like that.
certainly.
Yes, but we should not be like taking on extra burdens when the burden is on them. Like,
right.
If they were to claim special revelation, or when I say public revelation, I mean public revelation on the same par as the biblical books. That kind of nuance here. So public revelation ceased with the inscripturation of the final book in the New Testament. It's like, okay, and the verse that teaches this, and kind of show, like, they might throw out the verses, but then they'll soon realize, like, they're easily shot down. So that might actually get them to think, like, is this true? Because,
and so how they use your expertise, though, is that they can go and they can say, look, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain it to me? Pull out their notebook, which I tell them all to carry a dang notebook with them, because how do you maintain what Jennifer's problems are and consistently convey them from meeting to meeting if you're not writing them down?
And be sure also to ask, or at least make note of, not just what they're saying, but also like maybe some of the presuppositions that are underlying this. Like, I don't really see this in this text. Like, say they think Revelation 22 teaches it. Like, okay, the presupposition there would be like the book there is not just Revelation, it's the entirety of the Bible and stuff like that. So maybe like making a note of the presuppositions as well, because if you can actually answer the presuppositions for, like, say, one or two things, that will like get rid of like most of the texts that are going to be brought up, because you can show like none of these texts can actually from the get-go teach X, Y, and Z. That kind of neutralizes all possible proof texts as well. Now that's something that is a skill that's it might seem like very simple, but like it's something you have to pick up.
It's complicated.
It's like the laws of logic and rules of logic. Like you can't know them when you see them, but like you have to be able to think on the fly as well.
So how they can learn those, though, with respect to that, I think is you get the defined issue, you have them explain it, then you end the meeting and say, okay, thank you for sharing all of that. We'll let's set up another meeting for next week. And then you go call Jennifer, or then you go call Robert, and you say, here's what they talked about. That way that even the discussion is more specific. And I was telling a missionary yesterday, I said, if you call Robert and you say something like, they believe in, we've explained the Godhead, they explained the Trinity, we don't understand what they're explaining, and we're not sure how to respond to it. And they keep saying it's the same. Tell us what we're supposed to do about that. Well, how would you address that? Because that's the whole point of missionaries. I think the church puts too much pressure on them that you can do it on your own. In my mission, I had a bishop who we walked in, we had just been transferred in the area. There'd been no missionaries in the area for over a year. They transferred my companion and I in cold. And we looked at the area book and had nothing. We go to church that Sunday and walked in. The bishop's like, oh, it's good to have elders here and missionaries at all. And what are you guys going to do to get missionary work in the church? And I said, well, Bishop, we're going to get the members involved and get them to start helping to bring their friends and family to church who aren't members. And we're going to teach them. And he says, well, you can't put that burden on the members. and we had this fight. So I'm like, well, we're actually the teachers, you guys are the finders. So that's actually the dynamic of the church.
Yeah, once like a lot of members of the church and like even missionaries themselves divest themselves as like the missionaries are the experts. Missionaries are here to teach, as you noted, but like they tend to be like 18, 19, 20, 21 year olds, like, so they don't have much life experience. And I'm not saying they're dolts, but at the same time, I've only come across like one or two missionaries who really know their stuff, and they tend to be adult converts who studied the faith, like the two of us before making the plunge, if you will. So like they're just there to know the basics. That's why they're the victims of so many gotcha tactics by like Durbin et al. They probably never even thought of infinite regress or the kinfold discourse, before they went on the mission. But once, like, as a church, as a culture, we kind of stop imputing to them this level of authority or this level of expertise, and kind of realize, it's the adults and the more stable, geographically speaking members of the warden unit that are to be more informed and help teach and stuff like that. That will improve things.
And so what was funny about this story, though, is not a week later, after we and I had this discussion, there was announced a worldwide missionary broadcast with President Hinckley, where it was a special event. It was in 99. President Hinckley got up and he says, listen, members, it's your responsibility to bring converts to this church. And if you're not helping the missionaries, you're failing in your, basically it was just for like an hour. He went off on it. It was just a random, it's in the church website. You can find it. It's his worldwide missionary broadcast from President Hinckley. It's fantastic. And literally, so what was great about it is I got to sit in the pews with the bishop sitting up on the stand with the screen behind him, listening to this. And I got to sit there and smile at him as President Hinckley was telling him exactly what I had told him a couple of weeks prior to it. But it's just this understanding of this dynamic that, basically the missionary role is to introduce people to the Book of Mormon, invite them to read it, to help them to be encouraged to read it, and then to teach them 5 lessons, which basically form an outline of our beliefs. And that's it. Beyond that, go ask Robert, call Jennifer, and don't feel like you have to be burdened with some massive library of books in your room, Robert.
Yep. He's a show off. He's just showing it all off.
I have a friend that
just one of the rooms.
So I have a friend that I was talking to him about Robert, because I want him to listen to your podcast. And I said, look at this guy. He's read all those books. And he's like, he hasn't read all those books. That's
yes, he has.
That's a screen. I'm like, no, you listen to the podcast, man. And I guarantee you, after about 30 minutes of listening to him, you'll know he read those books.
Yeah.
It's not on the screen.
So yeah, it's amazing. So, but
All
no,
right.
it's a helpful resource. Thank you guys so much for talking with me today.
Absolutely.
It's
Thank you
my
for having
pleasure.
us.
And for those who want to listen to part 2, we will debate the economic versus hyperstatic filioque.
Not
Jen is
today.
the apostate
That's a different
filioqueist, and I will represent the Eastern Orthodox. Gregory Palamas
Hilarious.
denying Ron.
Oh my goodness.
Must be fun.
Yeah, nerds.
Yeah, I know. I just don't have the
Anyway.
time to be that big of a
Yeah.
nerd.
No,
Contra
don't do it.
Aquinas in the errors of the Greek and the Council of Florence.
Oh yeah. No, I do that every once in a while when I'm going to give a talk in church. I'll give some big, long, complicated theological say. So today I was asked to talk about whatever, and everybody's like,
I'm
I'm
talking
just
about the temptations of Christ tomorrow, so I'm addressing directly whether Christ could have actually sinned.
Oh, nice.
He could have.
well, he could.
If he couldn't, what's the point?
Yeah, it makes temptation nonsense. But
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going to be quoting. I'm actually going to be quoting from the Journal Discourses and other sources, just to
Oh, I
let you
love
see
it.
the look in their faces.
I'm not gonna have a bishop.
Uh,
training you.
All right, you guys, I gotta run.
All right, we'll
It's
see
been
ya.
fun.
Thanks a lot,
We'll definitely have
Jennifer.
to do something in sacramental theology.
Yeah.
Soon, so awesome.
Love it. Bye.
All right, we'll see y'all. Thanks a lot.